When the billionaire CEO chased down her own janitor in the rain, she wasn't offering charity. She was exposing a system built on prejudice instead of merit. Daniel Harper had walked into that interview wearing dignity like armor, knowing his borrowed suit couldn't hide years of midnight shifts and mounting hospital bills. They rejected him anyway, not because he lacked skill, but because he didn't look like success to people who'd never fought for it. What they didn't know was that the man they dismissed had once saved a life in their lobby, and the woman who owned the building had never forgotten. If you're watching from somewhere tonight, comment your city below and hit that like button. Let's see how far Daniel's story travels, because what happens next will make you believe that being truly seen can change everything. The fluorescent lights in the Meridian Tower's 7th floor conference room hummed with the kind of sterile indifference that Daniel Harper had learned to recognize over the years. He sat across from 3 people who held his future in their manicured hands, his spine straight despite the borrowed suit jacket that pulled slightly too tight across his shoulders. The fabric still smelled faintly of the dry cleaning solution his neighbor had insisted on using before lending it to him, a small kindness he'd promised to repay once things turned around. If things turned around. "Mr. Harper," the woman in the center began, glancing down at the papers before her with the kind of calculated disinterest that made Daniel's jaw tighten. Her name tag read Patricia Moreland, Director of Human Resources, and she wore her authority like expensive perfume, invisible but impossible to ignore. "Your application indicates you've been employed in facility services here at Meridian Tower for the past 4 years. The pause before employed landed like a stone in still water. "Yes, ma'am," Daniel replied, keeping his voice steady. "I work the overnight janitorial shift, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., Monday through Friday. Weekends when needed." The man to Patricia's left, younger, sharper dressed, with the kind of confident smirk that came from never having to prove himself, leaned back in his chair. His name tag identified him as Trevor Ashford, Senior Operations Manager. "And before that, your resume shows a 4-year gap between your previous position in customer service and your current role." Daniel had prepared for this question. He'd rehearsed it while mopping floors at 3 in the morning, while his son Liam slept in their studio apartment across town, while he counted the days until the next hospital bill arrived. But preparation didn't make the truth any easier to speak. "My wife passed away," he said quietly, the words still rough in his throat after 5 years. "Cancer. The treatments were expensive, and after she died, I had a newborn son to care for. I took the most stable work I could find that would let me be present for him during the day." The third interviewer, a woman with sharp features and sharper eyes named Rebecca Huang, Customer Experience Director, made a note on her tablet. "I see. And you believe that 4 years of janitorial work qualifies you for a front desk position in a building that serves some of the most prestigious companies in the city?" There it was. The question beneath the question. The assumption wrapped in professional courtesy. Daniel felt something cold and familiar settle in his chest. He'd known this moment would come, had felt it approaching since he'd first submitted his application 3 weeks ago, had sensed it in the surprised looks when he'd arrived for the interview in his borrowed suit, had heard it in the too careful politeness of their questions. But knowing didn't make it hurt any less. "I believe," he said slowly, choosing each word with precision, "that my 8 years of customer service experience before my wife's illness, combined with my intimate knowledge of this building and its operations, make me qualified. I know every tenant on every floor. I know which executives arrive early and which ones stay late. I've handled more emergencies in 4 years than most front desk personnel see in a decade." "Emergencies?" Trevor's smirk deepened. What kind of emergencies could a janitor possibly handle? The dismissiveness in his tone made Daniel's hands curl into fists beneath the table, but he kept his expression neutral. 2 years ago, a senior executive from Hartley Financial collapsed in the lobby after a late meeting. Heart attack. I performed CPR until the paramedics arrived, saved his life. Rebecca's stylist paused over her tablet. "That's quite a claim." "It's documented," Daniel replied evenly. "Security footage, incident report, letter of commendation from the building management. It's all in my application materials." Patricia shuffled through the papers again, her expression unchanging. "Yes, well, while we appreciate your initiative in that situation, Mr. Harper, The front desk position requires a certain level of professional presence. This is the first point of contact for clients visiting some of the most important companies in the region. Image matters. There it was again. Image. Daniel understood what she wasn't saying. He understood the subtext beneath every polite phrase, the judgment hidden in every pause. They weren't rejecting his qualifications. They were rejecting him. The man who cleaned their toilets at midnight, who emptied their trash bins and scrubbed their conference room floors, who wore work boots instead of Italian leather, who smelled like cleaning solution instead of cologne, who represented everything their carefully cultivated corporate image pretended didn't exist. He'd been a fool to think this would be different. "I see," Daniel said quietly. And he did see. Saw everything with painful clarity. "So what you're saying is that despite my qualifications, despite my experience, despite my proven ability to handle pressure and save lives, I don't look the part." Patricia's expression flickered, just for a moment, before settling back into professional neutrality. "We're saying that we have concerns about whether this role would be the best fit for you, Mr. Harper. Perhaps with some additional training, some professional development." "Additional training," Daniel repeated, the words tasting bitter. He'd seen this dance before in other interviews, other opportunities. The endless deferral disguised as helpful advice. More training, more experience, more, something that they would never quite define but would always find lacking. Trevor leaned forward, his voice taking on the patronizing tone of someone explaining something to a child. "Look, we're not saying you're not capable. We're just saying that jumping from janitorial services to a client-facing role is a big leap. Maybe you should consider working your way up gradually. There are positions in the mailroom, in the loading dock." "I applied for the front desk position," Daniel interrupted, his voice still calm but harder now, tempered by something that had been building throughout this entire conversation. "I applied because I'm qualified. I applied because I've earned the chance. And I applied because I thought merit might actually matter in this building I've maintained for 4 years." The silence that followed his words was heavy, uncomfortable. Rebecca exchanged a glance with Patricia. Trevor's smirk had faded into something that looked almost like embarrassment, though Daniel suspected that was giving him too much credit. "Mr. Harper," Patricia began, her tone shifting into what she probably thought was gentle finality. "We appreciate you taking the time to interview with us today. We have several other candidates to consider, and we'll be making our decision within the next week. We'll be in touch." They wouldn't be in touch. Daniel knew that with absolute certainty. This was the polite dismissal, the professional rejection, the door closing quietly but decisively. He could argue. He could point out the inequality, the unfairness, the barely concealed prejudice. He could fight. But he was tired of fighting battles that had been decided before he entered the room. Daniel stood slowly, his chair scraping softly against the polished floor he'd waxed countless times. He looked at each of them in turn, these people who had judged him not by his capabilities but by their assumptions, who had looked at his resume and seen only a janitor, who had decided his worth based on a title rather than his character. "Thank you for your time," he said quietly, gathering his folder of carefully prepared documents, copies of commendations, letters of recommendation from building tenants, certifications from online courses he'd taken during Liam's nap times. All of it suddenly meaningless. He turned toward the door, each step measured and deliberate. His borrowed suit jacket pulled across his shoulders, but he kept his spine straight. Dignity. That was all he had left, and they couldn't take that from him unless he surrendered it. "Mr. Harper," Patricia called as he reached for the door handle. He paused, but didn't turn. "For what it's worth, your work as a janitor has been exemplary. You should be proud of that." The words were meant to be kind, he supposed, a consolation prize, but they landed like salt in a wound. "I am proud of it," Daniel said, still facing the door. "Every floor I've mopped, every window I've cleaned, every trash bin I've emptied. I've done that work with integrity, because all honest work deserves to be done well. What I'm not proud of is working in a building where people measure worth by appearances instead of effort." He opened the door and stepped through, not waiting for a response. The hallway stretched before him, lined with the same modern art pieces he dusted every Tuesday, the same sleek furniture he'd rearranged after late-night events, the same pristine surfaces that never stayed clean without someone doing the invisible labor of maintaining them. The elevator was at the end of the hall, its polished doors reflecting his image as he approached. He looked tired, Daniel realized. Not just physically tired, though the overnight shifts left their mark in the lines around his eyes and the gray that had started threading through his hair at 32. No, this was a deeper exhaustion, the kind that came from hoping and being disappointed, from trying and being rejected, from believing that hard work and merit might actually be enough. The elevator chimed softly as it arrived. The doors opened to reveal empty space, and Daniel stepped inside, pressing the button for the lobby. As the doors began to close, he caught a glimpse of his reflection again, the borrowed suit that didn't quite fit, the shoes he'd shined that morning until they almost looked expensive, the face of a man who'd been foolish enough to think he could transcend other people's assumptions. The elevator descended smoothly, counting down floors with soft electronic tones. 7, 6, 5. Each number was another second closer to returning to the world where he belonged, the world of overnight shifts and hospital bills, of being invisible except when something needed cleaning, of working twice as hard for half the recognition. 4, 3, 2. The elevator slowed as it approached the lobby, and Daniel took a deep breath, preparing himself for the walk of shame through the gleaming space he maintained every night. He'd have to pass the security desk where Ramon worked days, who'd wished him good luck that morning. He'd have to cross the marble floors he kept spotless, walk beneath the chandelier he'd carefully cleaned just last week, exit through the rotating doors he'd polished until they gleamed. The elevator doors opened onto the Meridian Tower lobby, and Daniel stepped out into the late afternoon light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The space was magnificent, designed to impress, all soaring ceilings and expensive materials, every surface speaking of success and prestige and the kind of money that most people only dreamed about. Daniel had cleaned every inch of it. "Mr. Harper," Ramon called from the security desk, his weathered face breaking into a warm smile. "How did it go, hermano?" Daniel managed a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "About how I expected, Ramon. Thanks for asking." The older man's expression fell, understanding passing between them without additional words. Ramon had worked security at Meridian Tower for 15 years. He knew how these things went. He'd seen enough people like Daniel, qualified, hardworking, but wrong in ways that were never explicitly stated, pass through these doors with hope and leave with resignation. "Their loss," Ramon said firmly. "Anyone with eyes can see you'd be perfect for that job." "Apparently they weren't looking with their eyes," Daniel replied quietly. He raised a hand in farewell and turned toward the exit, his borrowed shoes clicking against the marble floor with each step. The rotating doors spun slowly, and Daniel pushed through into the cooling evening air. September in the city meant the oppressive summer heat was finally breaking, replaced by the kind of crisp autumn that made breathing feel easier. He paused on the sidewalk outside Meridian Tower, looking up at the glass and steel structure that had been his workplace for 4 years. Somewhere up there, in offices he'd never been invited to enter except to clean them, people were conducting business worth millions. They were making decisions, closing deals, building careers. And they did it all in spaces maintained by people they never truly saw, people like him, who worked in the shadows and asked only for a chance to step into the light. He'd been stupid to think today would be different. Daniel started walking, his hands shoved into the pockets of his borrowed slacks. The interview had run late, nearly 5 p.m. now, which meant he'd have to hurry if he wanted to pick Liam up from his neighbor Mrs. Chen's apartment before she needed to leave for her own evening shift at the hospital. The bus stop was 3 blocks away, and the number 47 would get him home in about 40 minutes if traffic wasn't too bad. The weight of failure pressed down on his shoulders as he walked, heavier than any physical burden. He'd allowed himself to hope. That was his mistake. He'd looked at that job posting 3 weeks ago and seen not just an opportunity for better hours and better pay, but a chance to show his son that hard work mattered, that integrity had value, that you could fall down and get back up and build something better. What a stupid, naive thing to believe. "Mr. Harper! Daniel, wait!" The voice cut through the ambient noise of the city, car engines, distant conversations, the hum of urban life. Daniel stopped and turned, confused, to see a woman running toward him. Not just any woman, but one he recognized immediately, despite only ever having seen her from a distance. Evelyn Cross, CEO of Cross Industries and majority owner of Meridian Tower itself. She was in her early 40s, dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Daniel's monthly rent, her dark hair pulled back in a neat bun. But what struck him wasn't her obvious wealth or authority. It was the fact that she was running, her expensive heels clicking rapidly against the pavement, slightly out of breath by the time she reached him. A CEO. Running after a janitor. Ms. Cross? Daniel's voice came out uncertain, shocked. He'd seen her perhaps a dozen times over the years, always from a distance, always when he was in the background doing his work while she moved through the building with the confident stride of someone who owned the ground beneath her feet. Is something wrong? She stopped a few feet away, catching her breath, and Daniel noticed she was holding something, a tablet, screen glowing with what looked like security footage. Her expression was difficult to read, a mixture of emotions that Daniel couldn't quite parse. I need to ask you something, she said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that made it clear she was used to asking questions and receiving immediate answers. That interview you just had, the one for the front desk position, why did you walk out? Daniel blinked, completely thrown by the question. They finished the interview. They said they'd be in touch. No, Evelyn said sharply, and there was something in her tone that made Daniel stand a little straighter. They dismissed you. I watched the whole thing. She held up the tablet, and Daniel could now see clearly that it was indeed security footage, the conference room showing his interview from an angle he hadn't known existed. The audio isn't great, but I saw enough. I saw their faces, I heard their tone, and I saw you walk out with your head high when a lot of people would have begged. Daniel felt something twist in his chest, embarrassment at being watched, confusion at why she cared, and underneath it all, a flicker of something that felt dangerously like hope. I don't understand. Why were you watching? Evelyn's expression softened slightly, though her eyes remained sharp and assessing. Because 2 years ago, you saved Richard Hartley's life in my lobby. He's not just a tenant, Mr. Harper. He's been my business partner for 15 years, and when I heard you'd applied for a position, I wanted to see how it went. Her jaw tightened. What I saw was 3 people I employed deciding you weren't good enough based on everything except your actual qualifications. The words hung in the cooling air between them, and Daniel felt the full weight of what she was saying settle over him like a blanket. She'd seen it. She'd watched his humiliation, witnessed his dismissal, observed the careful corporate dance of rejection based on bias rather than merit. And instead of looking away, instead of pretending she hadn't seen, she'd run after him into the street. Ms. Cross, Daniel began, but his voice caught. He cleared his throat and tried again. I appreciate you saying that, but do you know what Richard told me after you saved his life? Evelyn interrupted, and there was something fierce in her expression now. He said the man who saved him worked as a janitor. He said he'd tried to tip you afterward and you'd refused. He said you'd told him you were just doing what any decent person would do. She took a step closer, her eyes locked on his. Do you remember that? Daniel did remember. Richard Hartley had collapsed right in front of the elevators during a late-night meeting, his face going gray, his breath coming in labored gasps. Daniel had been emptying the trash bins nearby when he heard the man hit the floor. CPR training from his previous job, training he'd maintained even through the hardest years because you never knew when it might matter, had kicked in automatically. He'd worked on Hartley for 7 minutes that felt like hours until the paramedics arrived. And yes, afterward, when Hartley had recovered and tried to press $1,000 cash into Daniel's hand, Daniel had refused it, because it hadn't been about money. It had been about seeing another human being in crisis and doing what needed to be done. I remember, Daniel said quietly. Evelyn nodded once, decisive. You refused money from a man worth $60 million because you didn't save his life for a reward. And today, 3 people who work for me decided you weren't good enough to sit at a desk and greet clients. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was cold with controlled anger. Not directed at him, Daniel realized, but at what had happened in that conference room. Tell me something, Mr. Harper. If I offered you that front desk position right now, would you take it? Daniel's heart rate kicked up, hope and caution warring in his chest. That depends. On what? On whether it's because you feel guilty, Daniel said bluntly, surprising himself with his own honesty. Or because you feel sorry for me? Because if it is, then no. I don't want pity, Ms. Cross. I don't want charity. I want to be hired because I'm qualified, not because you feel bad about what happened up there. For a long moment, Evelyn just looked at him, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, something that might have been respect flickered across her face. Do you know how many people in your position would have just said yes? How many people would have taken the job offer and run before I could change my mind? Probably most of them, Daniel admitted. But I have a 5-year-old son who's learning from me every day what it means to be a man of integrity. I can't teach him to accept handouts, no matter how much we might need them. Evelyn's expression shifted again, and this time Daniel was sure he saw respect there, clear and unmistakable. You saved Richard Hartley's life. You've maintained this building with a level of care and attention that my facilities director mentions in every quarterly review. You've never missed a shift in 4 years, never had a single complaint, and according to multiple tenants who've taken the time to write to management, you're unfailingly professional and kind. She paused, letting each word land with precision. Those are the reasons I'm offering you this position, Mr. Harper. Not guilt, not pity. Merit. Daniel felt something in his chest crack. Not break, but crack the way ice cracks in spring, letting warmth seep through. The interview panel made a decision based on bias, not business, Evelyn cut in sharply. And I'm about to correct that. But I need to know, are you interested in this position? Really interested? Because if I do this, if I override their decision, you're going to face pushback. People are going to assume you got special treatment. They're going to question whether you deserve to be there. It won't be easy. Daniel thought about Liam, waiting at Mrs. Chen's apartment, probably watching cartoons and eating the goldfish crackers she always kept stocked for him. He thought about the hospital bills stacked on his counter at home, the ones he paid down bit by bit with each paycheck. He thought about working midnight shifts while his son slept, about missing school events because they happened during his sleeping hours, about the bone-deep exhaustion of trying to be both parents to a little boy who deserved so much more than one tired father could give. But most of all, he thought about what he'd told Liam just last night, when his son had asked why Daddy had to work at night when other kids' parents worked during the day. Because all honest work is important, Daniel had said, kneeling down to look Liam in his eyes, his late wife Sarah's eyes, brown and bright and full of trust. And because Daddy is working hard so we can have better opportunities someday. But you should always remember that how you do something matters more than what you're doing, okay? Liam had nodded solemnly and Daniel had hugged him tight, hoping his son wouldn't notice the tears in his eyes. Now standing in front of Evelyn Cross on a cooling September evening, Daniel straightened his shoulders in the borrowed suit that didn't quite fit and looked her directly in the eye. Yes, he said clearly, I'm interested, and I'm not afraid of hard work or proving myself. I've been doing both my entire life. Evelyn smiled, a real smile this time, the kind that reached her eyes. Good. Then let's go back inside, because I have some people who need to understand exactly how employment decisions are going to work in my building from now on. The elevator ride back up to the 7th floor felt completely different from the descent Daniel had taken just minutes before. Then, he'd been alone with his disappointment, watching the numbers count down like the closing of a door. Now, Evelyn Cross stood beside him, her presence commanding even in the confined space, her tablet still clutched in one hand while she typed rapidly with the other. I'm sending an email to Patricia, Trevor, and Rebecca, she said without looking up from her screen. Telling them to remain in the conference room. They're going to want to leave. People always want to escape before accountability arrives. But they'll stay. Daniel's stomach twisted with a complicated mixture of vindication and apprehension. Part of him wanted to see their faces when they realized what was about to happen. Another part, the part that had learned to make himself small and invisible over 4 years of overnight shifts, wanted to tell Evelyn this wasn't necessary, that he could just start the job quietly without confrontation. But that second part was the voice of exhaustion, not wisdom, and Daniel was tired of making himself small. What exactly are you going to say to them? He asked quietly. Evelyn's fingers paused over her tablet. She looked at him, and in her expression Daniel saw something he hadn't expected. Not just anger at her employee's behavior, but something deeper. Something personal. I'm going to tell them the truth, she said, that they let their biases make a decision that their judgment should have made, that they looked at a qualified candidate and saw only what was convenient to see, and that in doing so, they failed not just you, but the company and themselves. She resumed typing, her jaw set. I'm also going to tell them that this is exactly the kind of thinking that keeps organizations stagnant and mediocre. The elevator chimed softly as it passed the 4th floor. 5th, 6th. Ms. Cross, Daniel began, then stopped, unsure how to voice what he was feeling. Evelyn, she corrected, glancing at him. If you're going to work front desk, we'll be seeing each other regularly. You might as well use my name. Evelyn, Daniel repeated, the name feeling strange in his mouth. Too familiar, too equal. I need to ask you something. Why does this matter so much to you? I mean, I appreciate it more than I can say, but you're the CEO. You must have 1,000 things more important than one hiring decision. The elevator reached the 7th floor and stopped, but Evelyn didn't immediately move toward the doors. Instead, she turned to face him fully, and in her eyes Daniel saw something that looked almost like old pain. 20 years ago, she said quietly, I was a junior analyst at a financial firm in Boston. I had graduated top of my class from Wharton, had impeccable credentials, and I was good at my job. Really good. She paused, and Daniel saw her hand tighten around her tablet. And for 3 years, I watched men with half my qualifications get promoted over me. When I finally demanded to know why, my supervisor told me I was too aggressive and didn't fit the company culture. Daniel felt something shift in his understanding of this moment. This wasn't just about him. This was about every time someone had been judged by appearance instead of merit, every time potential had been dismissed because it came in an unexpected package. What did you do? He asked. A small, fierce smile crossed Evelyn's face. I quit. Started my own investment firm with money I'd saved and borrowed from everyone who'd take my calls. Spent 5 years building it from nothing into something people couldn't ignore. And then I bought the company that had passed me over and fired every single person who'd been part of that old boys club. The smile faded, replaced by something more somber. But that took years, Daniel. Years of fighting and proving myself and being told I wasn't enough. If someone had intervened earlier, if someone with power had actually looked at what I could do instead of what I looked like on paper. She trailed off, then straightened her shoulders. I can't change what happened to me, but I can make sure it doesn't happen in companies I control. Not on my watch. The elevator doors had been waiting patiently, and now Evelyn pressed the door open button and stepped into the hallway. Daniel followed, his borrowed shoes once again clicking against the polished floors, but this time he wasn't alone. This time, someone was walking beside him, who saw him not as a janitor who'd overreached, but as a person who'd been wronged. The conference room door was closed when they reached it, but through the glass panel, Daniel could see all 3 interviewers still inside. Patricia was on her phone, her expression annoyed. Trevor was leaning back in his chair, looking bored. Rebecca was gathering her things, clearly preparing to leave. Evelyn didn't knock. She opened the door and walked in with the kind of authority that came from owning the building they stood in, the company they worked for, and probably a dozen other things besides. Daniel followed, and the moment the 3 interviewers registered his presence, his return, their expressions shifted into various shades of confusion and discomfort. Ms. Cross, Patricia said, standing quickly and smoothing her skirt. I received your email. We were just preparing to leave, Evelyn finished, her voice cool and professional. Yes, I can see that. Sit down, all of you. This won't take long. There was no mistaking that this was a command, not a request. Patricia sat. Trevor straightened in his chair, his earlier smugness evaporating. Rebecca put down the bag she'd been about to pick up and folded her hands on the table, her expression carefully neutral. Evelyn walked to the head of the conference table, the seat that had been empty during Daniel's interview, and remained standing. She set her tablet down with deliberate care, the screen still showing the security footage from earlier. Daniel stood near the door, unsure of where he was supposed to be in this moment. Mr. Harper, Evelyn said, gesturing to the chair he'd occupied earlier. Please, sit. Daniel moved to the chair and sat, acutely aware of 3 pairs of eyes tracking his movement. The borrowed suit suddenly felt even more uncomfortable, but he kept his spine straight and his expression calm. "I want to be very clear about something," Evelyn began, her gaze moving from Patricia to Trevor to Rebecca with laser precision. "What happened in this room an hour ago was not a professional hiring decision. It was a display of bias disguised as judgment, and it is exactly the kind of thinking I have worked for 20 years to eliminate from every organization I lead." Patricia's face had gone pale. "Ms. Cross, I'm not sure what you—" "I watched the entire interview," Evelyn cut in, tapping her tablet. "Security footage. Every question, every pause, every dismissive comment about janitors and mailrooms and whether someone looks the part." She paused, letting that sink in. "So please don't insult both our intelligences by pretending you don't know exactly what I'm talking about." The silence in the room was thick enough to cut. Trevor had the decency to look uncomfortable now, his fingers drumming nervously on the table. Rebecca's carefully neutral expression had cracked slightly, revealing something that might have been embarrassment underneath. "Daniel Harper," Evelyn continued, and hearing his full name spoken with such weight made something in Daniel's chest tighten, "has 8 years of customer service experience in high-pressure environments. He has maintained this building with exemplary performance for 4 years, earning commendations from multiple tenants. He has proven himself capable of handling medical emergencies with calm professionalism. Specifically, he saved the life of Richard Hartley, a senior partner at Hartley Financial, using CPR training he maintained on his own time and at his own expense." She paused, her voice hardening. "And yet, somehow, the 3 of you decided he wasn't qualified to greet clients at a desk." "Ms. Cross," Trevor began, his voice lacking its earlier confidence, "we had legitimate concerns about the transition from facilities services to a client-facing role. It's a significant change in—" "In what?" Evelyn's voice cut like a blade. "In visibility. In status. Say what you actually mean, Trevor." Trevor's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. He looked like a man who just realized he was standing in quicksand, and every movement was making him sink deeper. Rebecca cleared her throat carefully. "We were concerned about whether Mr. Harper would have the professional polish necessary for representing Meridian Tower's image to high-value clients." "Professional polish," Evelyn repeated, and there was something dangerous in her tone now. "You mean the kind of polish that comes from expensive suits and the right schools? The kind that has nothing to do with actual competence or character?" She leaned forward slightly, her hands flat on the table. "Let me tell you what professional polish actually means. It means showing up every single day and doing your job with integrity. It means treating every task, no matter how small, as important. It means seeing someone in crisis and helping them without expectation of reward. Daniel Harper has more professional polish than most of the executives who work in this building." Daniel sat very still, barely breathing, watching this woman dismantle the assumptions that had controlled his life for 4 years. Part of him wanted to feel vindicated. Another part felt almost uncomfortable with the level of anger Evelyn was displaying on his behalf, as if he didn't quite deserve this fierce defense. "Ms. Cross," Patricia said, her voice strained but attempting to maintain some professional composure, "if you felt Mr. Harper was qualified for the position, you could have simply instructed us to hire him. There was no need for what? For confrontation? For accountability?" Evelyn straightened, crossing her arms. "That's exactly the problem, Patricia. You think this is about one hiring decision, one person, one job. But it's not. It's about the systematic way we overlook talent because it doesn't come in the package we expect. It's about the unconscious bias that makes us see a janitor instead of a professional, a uniform instead of a person, a job title instead of a human being with skills and potential." The words hung in the air, and Daniel felt them settle over him like a weight and a relief simultaneously. Someone was finally saying out loud what he'd felt for years, but had never had the standing to voice. Someone with power was acknowledging that the obstacles he'd faced weren't in his imagination, weren't his fault, weren't evidence of his inadequacy. "I have a question for all 3 of you," Evelyn said, her voice quieter now, but no less intense. "If Daniel Harper had walked in here wearing a $2,000 suit, if his previous job title had been facilities director instead of janitor, If he'd spent the last 4 years managing a cleaning crew instead of being part of one, would you have asked him different questions? Would you have made different assumptions? No one answered immediately. The silence stretched long enough that Daniel could hear the faint hum of the building's ventilation system, the distant sound of someone laughing in an office down the hall, the electric buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead. Finally, Rebecca spoke, her voice subdued. Probably yes. It was a small admission, but it cracked something open. Patricia shifted in her seat, her earlier defensiveness giving way to something that looked like uncomfortable recognition. Even Trevor, with his smug confidence thoroughly dismantled, seemed to be confronting something he'd rather not see. At least you're being honest, Evelyn said, though there was no warmth in her acknowledgement. That's more than most people manage. She picked up her tablet and typed something quickly, then looked back at the three interviewers. Daniel Harper will be starting in the front desk position, effective immediately. However, because he's transitioning from a different role, and because I will not have anyone, including Daniel himself, questioning whether he earned this position, he'll go through our standard training program. Full pay during training, benefits starting day one, and every metric of success clearly defined. Daniel's head snapped toward Evelyn. This wasn't what he'd expected. He'd thought, well, he wasn't sure what he'd thought, that she'd override their decision and he'd just start working. But this was different. This was being given not just the job, but the tools and structure to prove he deserved it, to prove it to himself as much as anyone else. The training program is 6 weeks, Patricia said slowly, and Daniel could hear her trying to process this new reality. It covers customer service protocols, building systems, emergency procedures, tenant relations. I know what the training program covers, Evelyn interrupted. I designed it 5 years ago, and Daniel will complete every module, meet every standard, and be evaluated on the same criteria as any other candidate. She looked at Daniel, and there was something in her expression that he understood instinctively. She was protecting him. By insisting on the training, by making him prove himself through official channels, she was ensuring that no one could claim he'd gotten the job through favoritism or charity. Does that work for you, Daniel? Daniel found his voice, rough with emotion he was trying to keep contained. Yes. Thank you. Don't thank me, Evelyn said firmly. You earned this opportunity the moment you saved Richard Hartley's life. You earned it every night you showed up for work when you could have quit a dozen times over. You earned it by being the kind of person who refuses money for doing the right thing. She turned back to the interviewers. The three of you will not be involved in Daniel's training or evaluation. I'm assigning that to Marcus Chen in operations, someone who actually understands that talent comes in many forms. Are we clear? 3 heads nodded in unison. Patricia looked like she wanted to say something, perhaps defend herself or explain or apologize, but the words seemed to die before they reached her lips. Good, Evelyn said. She picked up her tablet and walked toward the door, then paused and looked back at them. One more thing. All 3 of you will be enrolling in our unconscious bias training. The next session starts in 2 weeks. Attendance is mandatory. Her voice softened slightly, taking on something that was almost sympathetic. Look, I know you're not bad people. I know you probably didn't wake up this morning planning to reject a qualified candidate because of bias. But that's exactly how bias works. It operates below conscious thought, shaping our decisions without us realizing it. So we're going to make it conscious. We're going to examine it, and we're going to be better. She didn't wait for a response. She opened the door and stepped into the hallway, and Daniel stood quickly to follow her. As he moved toward the door, he felt compelled to turn back, to look at the 3 people who had rejected him just an hour ago. Patricia met his eyes, and to her credit, she didn't look away. Mr. Harper, she said quietly, I hope you'll accept my apology. What happened here today it was wrong, and I should have known better. It wasn't enough. It couldn't erase what had happened, couldn't undo the assumptions they'd made, or the dismissiveness they'd shown. But it was something, an acknowledgement, a beginning. I appreciate that, Daniel said, keeping his voice neutral. And I hope you'll all learn something from this. Because I'm not the only person who's ever been underestimated based on appearances. He walked out before anyone could respond, closing the conference room door behind him with a soft click. Evelyn was waiting a few feet down the hallway, her expression unreadable. That was harder than I expected, Daniel admitted. his hands trembling slightly now that the adrenaline was catching up to him. "Good things usually are," Evelyn replied. She started walking toward the elevators, and Daniel fell into step beside her. "How are you feeling?" "Honestly, I'm not sure," Daniel said. Vindicated, grateful, terrified, all at the same time. Evelyn smiled slightly. "That sounds about right. This is going to be a big change for you, Daniel. Not just the job itself, but everything that comes with it. Different hours, different responsibilities, different visibility." The elevator arrived and they stepped inside. Evelyn pressed the button for the executive floor, the 12th, the one Daniel had only ever visited after midnight when no one was there. "I need to introduce you to Marcus Chen," Evelyn explained, noticing Daniel's glance at the button. "He's going to be overseeing your training. Good man, fair evaluator, and he doesn't care where you came from, only where you're going." The elevator rose smoothly, and Daniel watched the numbers climb, 7, 8, 9, each floor taking him higher than he'd ever gone during business hours. When the doors opened onto the 12th floor, he was struck by how different it looked when it was populated. During his overnight shifts, the executive floor was silent and empty, just another space to clean. Now, people moved purposefully through the hallways, conversations hummed behind partially open doors, and the energy of active business filled every corner. "This way," Evelyn said, leading him down a corridor lined with glass-walled offices. Through the transparent walls, Daniel could see people working at stand-up desks, conducting video conferences, hunched over laptops with expressions of deep concentration. Some of them glanced up as Evelyn passed, their faces registering surprise at seeing the CEO walking the halls at this hour, and even more surprise at seeing a man in a slightly ill-fitting suit walking beside her. They reached an office near the end of the hall, and Evelyn knocked briskly on the doorframe. "Marcus, do you have a minute?" A man in his mid-40s looked up from his computer, his face breaking into a warm smile when he saw Evelyn. "Always for you. What's up?" His gaze shifted to Daniel, and there was open curiosity in his expression, but no judgment. "Marcus Chen, meet Daniel Harper," Evelyn said, stepping into the office. "Daniel is going to be starting our front desk training program, and I'd like you to oversee his progress." Marcus stood and extended his hand across his desk. "Good to meet you, Daniel. Front desk, huh? That's a demanding position? What's your background?" Daniel shook his hand, appreciating the straightforward question. 8 years in customer service, most recently 4 years in facility services here at Meridian Tower. "Facilities," Marcus repeated, and something shifted in his expression, not negative, but thoughtful. "So you know this building inside and out. That's actually a huge advantage for front desk work. You'll know things our usual candidates have to spend weeks learning." He glanced at Evelyn. "What prompted the career transition?" "Merit," Evelyn said simply, "and a hiring panel that almost missed it. I'd like you to put Daniel through the standard program. All 6 weeks, every module, same evaluation criteria we use for everyone else." Marcus nodded slowly, his eyes moving between Evelyn and Daniel as he clearly picked up on the subtext of that statement. "Understood. When do you want him to start?" "Tomorrow, if Daniel's available," Evelyn said, then looked at him. "Is that too fast? I realize you'll need to adjust your schedule, maybe arrange new childcare." "I can make it work," Daniel said quickly, his mind already racing through logistics. Mrs. Chen would help with Liam during the day. His neighbor was always looking for extra income, and watching a 5-year-old for a few hours after school wouldn't be difficult. And being able to have dinner with his son every night, to tuck him in, to be present during normal hours, that alone made any adjustment worth it. "What time should I be here?" "Training starts at 8 a.m., Marcus said. "First day is usually orientation, benefits enrollment, facility tour, that kind of thing. Then we get into the actual job training." He smiled. "Fair warning, it's comprehensive. We cover everything from basic greeting protocols to emergency procedures to managing difficult clients. It can be intense." "I've maintained this building at night for 4 years, Daniel said, feeling some of his earlier confidence returning. "I've handled medical emergencies, security concerns, late-night maintenance crises, and everything in between. I think I can handle intense." Something like approval flickered across Marcus's face. "I believe you. All right, tomorrow morning, 8 a.m. sharp. Meet me at the security desk in the lobby, and we'll get started." Evelyn nodded, satisfied. Thank you, Marcus. I'll let you get back to work. She gestured for Daniel to follow her back into the hallway, and once they were far enough from Marcus's office, she stopped and turned to face him. There's one more thing we need to discuss. Your schedule change means you'll need different childcare arrangements. I want to make sure you have time to set that up properly before you start. I can figure it out, Daniel assured her, though his mind was already calculating costs. Mrs. Chen was kind, but she couldn't watch Liam for free. Daycare was expensive. After-school programs had waiting lists. It would work out. It had to work out, but it would be tight. Evelyn's expression suggested she was reading his thoughts. The front desk position comes with childcare benefits, she said carefully. Up to $500 a month toward qualified care providers. It's part of our family support program. Daniel felt his throat tighten. $500. That would more than cover Mrs. Chen and give him breathing room for other expenses. Maybe even let him start paying down the medical bills faster. I don't know what to say, he managed. Say you'll be here tomorrow at 8 a.m., ready to work harder than you've ever worked, Evelyn replied. Because that training program is genuinely difficult, Daniel. Marcus is fair but thorough. He'll push you. And you're going to have to prove to him, to yourself, to everyone who's watching that you deserve this position. Can you do that? Daniel thought about his son, waiting at Mrs. Chen's apartment. He thought about every overnight shift he'd worked while other people slept, every floor he'd mopped while dreaming of something better, every moment he'd felt invisible while doing essential work. He thought about Sarah, his wife, who'd believed in him even when he'd stopped believing in himself. Yes, he said firmly, I can do that. Evelyn smiled, a real smile, warm and genuine. Good. Then I'll see you around the building, Daniel Harper, and welcome to the next chapter of your life. She walked away down the corridor, her heels clicking purposefully against the polished floor, leaving Daniel standing alone in the executive hallway with a future that looked completely different than it had just 2 hours ago. His heart was racing, his hands were still shaking slightly, and he had about 1,000 things to figure out before tomorrow morning. But for the first time in 5 years, Daniel Harper felt something he'd almost forgotten existed. Hope. Not the fragile, desperate hope that came from wishing things might get better, but the solid, grounded hope that came from seeing a real path forward. A chance earned not through luck or charity, but through recognition of his worth. He walked to the elevator and pressed the button for the lobby, watching the executive floor disappear as the car descended. When the doors opened onto the ground floor, Ramon looked up from the security desk, his weathered face breaking into a confused smile. Back already? I thought, wait, what happened? You look different. Daniel walked over to the security desk, and as he did, he realized Ramon was right. He did feel different, straighter, lighter, more present in his own skin. I got the job, Daniel said. And saying the words out loud made them real in a way they hadn't been even moments before. I start training tomorrow, 8 a.m. Ramon's eyes widened, then his face split into a grin so wide it seemed to take over his entire expression. Dios mío, Daniel, that's incredible. I knew they'd see how good you are. Actually, they didn't, Daniel admitted. They rejected me. But the CEO saw what happened and intervened. She's giving me a real chance. Training, evaluation, everything official. Ramon came around the desk and pulled Daniel into a quick, fierce hug. Then you show them, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You show all of them what I already know, that you're one of the best people in this building, no matter what floor you work on. Daniel hugged him back, grateful for this man who'd always treated him with dignity regardless of his position. Thank you, Ramon, for everything. When they separated, Ramon was wiping his eyes unselfconsciously. You go pick up that boy of yours and you celebrate tonight, you hear me? This is a big deal. I will, Daniel promised. He headed for the rotating doors, then paused and looked back at the lobby, the space he'd maintained for 4 years, the marble floors he'd kept gleaming, the chandelier he'd carefully cleaned, the front desk where he'd soon be sitting instead of cleaning. Tomorrow, everything changed. Tomorrow, he started proving that merit mattered more than assumptions, that character counted more than appearances, that a man could fall down and get back up and build something better. But tonight, he had a 5-year-old son to hug and good news to share. Daniel pushed through the rotating doors into the cooling September evening, and this time when he walked away from Meridian Tower, he knew he'd be walking back through those doors tomorrow morning with his head held high and a future worth fighting for. The bus ride home passed in a blur of thoughts and plans. He'd need to talk to Mrs. Chen about extended hours. He'd need to adjust his sleep schedule. Transitioning from overnight work to morning shifts would take time. He'd need to find appropriate clothes for the training period, though hopefully the front desk position came with some kind of uniform allowance. He'd need to tell Liam that things were about to get better. When Daniel reached Mrs. Chen's apartment, he knocked quickly, his heart still racing with the reality of what had happened. Mrs. Chen opened the door, Liam visible behind her at the kitchen table with crayons spread around him. "Mr. Harper," she said, her kind face creasing with concern. "You're back earlier than expected. Is everything—" "Daddy!" Liam launched himself from his chair and ran to the door, wrapping his small arms around Daniel's legs. "You're home! Did you get the job?" Daniel knelt down so he was eye level with his son, taking in those brown eyes so like Sarah's, that trust and hope that made Daniel want to be better than he was. "I did, buddy. I got the job." Liam's face lit up with pure joy, and he threw his arms around Daniel's neck. "Really? Really, really? Really, really?" Daniel confirmed, hugging his son tight. Over Liam's shoulder, he saw Mrs. Chen's eyes fill with tears, her hand pressed to her chest. "Oh, Daniel," she said softly, "I'm so happy for you. You deserve this." "Thank you," Daniel said, his voice rough. "And I need to talk to you about watching Liam during the new hours. I can pay more now. There are benefits, childcare support." Mrs. Chen waved her hand dismissively. "We'll work it out. The important thing is that good things are finally happening for you." She smiled through her tears. "Your wife would be so proud." Daniel felt his own eyes burning, and he held Liam a little tighter. Sarah would be proud. She'd always believed in him, even during the worst times, even when he'd stopped believing in himself. She'd made him promise, in those last lucid days before the cancer took her, that he'd never give up. On himself, on their son, on building a life worth living. "Come on, buddy," Daniel said, standing and taking Liam's hand. "Let's go home. We have a lot to talk about." They walked the 2 blocks to their studio apartment together, Liam chattering excitedly about his day at kindergarten, about the picture he'd drawn of Daniel in a suit, about how he'd told all his friends his daddy was going to get an important job. Daniel listened and responded and felt the weight of the day finally settling over him, not crushing, but grounding, real. Their apartment was small, cramped, the kind of place you lived in when you were surviving rather than thriving. But it was clean and warm, and the walls were covered with Liam's artwork and photos of Sarah. Home. Daniel made them a simple dinner, spaghetti with jarred sauce, garlic bread from the freezer, and they sat at their tiny table while he explained what had happened in words a 5-year-old could understand. "So Daddy's not going to work at night anymore?" Liam asked, his eyes wide. "That's right. I'll work during the day, like other kids' parents, which means I can have dinner with you every night and tuck you in, and maybe even help with your homework when you get older." Liam processed this, then asked the question that pierced Daniel's heart. "Does this mean we're not poor anymore?" Daniel took a breath, choosing his words carefully. "It means things are going to get easier, buddy. We'll still need to be careful with money, but there will be more of it. And more importantly, Daddy will be home more. We'll have more time together." "That's better than money," Liam said solemnly, and Daniel had to turn away for a moment to compose himself. After dinner, after bath time, after 3 stories and 2 glasses of water and 1 more hug, Daniel finally tucked Liam into bed. He sat on the edge of the mattress, watching his son's eyes grow heavy, and felt the full weight of responsibility and possibility settle over him. "Daddy," Liam mumbled, already half asleep. "I knew you'd get the job. You're the best daddy in the world." "I love you, buddy," Daniel whispered. "More than anything." "Love you too," Liam murmured, and then he was asleep, his breathing evening out into the peaceful rhythm of childhood dreams. Daniel sat there for a long time, watching his son sleep in the soft glow of the nightlight. Tomorrow, everything changed. Tomorrow, he started proving himself all over again. Tomorrow, he began building the life he'd promised Sarah he would build for their son. But tonight, he let himself feel it, all of it, the fear and the hope, the exhaustion and the exhilaration, the awareness that he'd been given something precious and rare. A genuine chance to be seen for who he really was, not who circumstances had forced him to become. In the morning, Daniel Harper would walk into Meridian Tower for the first time during daylight hours as something other than the invisible janitor. He would face 6 weeks of intensive training, prove himself to evaluators who would be watching his every move, and earn his place at that front desk through competence and character. But tonight, he was just a father sitting beside his sleeping son, grateful for second chances and CEOs who ran after janitors in the rain, grateful for the people who saw worth where others saw only job titles, grateful for the possibility of building something better from the ruins of what had been lost. Tomorrow would be hard. But Daniel had been through hard before. And this time, he wasn't walking into the darkness alone. This time, someone had turned on the lights. Daniel arrived at Meridian Tower at 7:45 the next morning, 15 minutes early, because being late wasn't an option when you were already fighting against assumptions. He dropped Liam off at Mrs. Chen's apartment with promises of dinner together that evening, had put on the best clothes he owned, khakis that were slightly faded but clean, a button-down shirt Sarah had bought him years ago for job interviews that never went anywhere, and had ridden the bus with his stomach churning with equal parts anticipation and dread. The lobby looked different in the morning light. During his overnight shifts, the space had belonged to him and the other invisible workers who maintained it. Now it hummed with the energy of people arriving for their workdays, designer shoes clicking across marble floors he knew intimately, expensive briefcases and coffee cups in hands that had never had to consider whether they could afford both breakfast and bus fare. Daniel stood near the rotating doors for a moment, watching this world he'd only ever observed from the shadows, and felt the weight of everything he was attempting settle over his shoulders. "Daniel," Marcus Chen's voice cut through his spiraling thoughts. The operations manager was walking toward him with a warm smile and 2 cups of coffee. "You're early. Good habit to have. Coffee?" Daniel accepted the cup gratefully, surprised by the gesture. "Thank you. I wasn't sure what to expect today." "Honestly, a lot of paperwork and boring administrative stuff," Marcus said with a laugh. "But necessary boring stuff. Come on, let's get you set up." They walked past the security desk where Ramon was just starting his shift. The older man caught Daniel's eye and gave him a subtle thumbs up, his weathered face creasing with pride. That small gesture steadied something in Daniel's chest, reminding him that he had people in his corner even here. Marcus led him to a conference room on the 2nd floor, not the same one where he'd been interviewed, thank whatever powers existed, and spent the next 2 hours walking him through paperwork that felt surreal in its implications. Health insurance forms that would cover Liam's asthma medication, dental benefits, vision coverage, a retirement account that Daniel could contribute to, with company matching that seemed almost too good to be true. The childcare stipend Evelyn had mentioned, $500 monthly that would be direct deposited into his account. "This is a lot," Daniel said at one point, staring at the benefits summary. During his janitorial work, he'd had basic health coverage and nothing else. This felt like winning a lottery he hadn't known existed. "Meridian Tower takes care of its people," Marcus replied, and there was no irony in his voice, no acknowledgement of the fact that Daniel had worked for this building for 4 years without accessing most of these benefits. "Front desk is a critical position. You're the face of this building, the first impression for every client and visitor. We invest in that." After the paperwork came the facility tour, and this was where Daniel's unique perspective began to show itself. Marcus walked him through the building's layout, explaining the locations of tenant offices, emergency equipment, building services. But Daniel already knew all of it, knew it better than Marcus did in some cases. "Fire extinguishers are located every 50 feet on each floor," Marcus was saying as they walked the 3rd-floor corridor. "You'll need to know these locations in case of emergency." "There's one missing on this floor," Daniel said without thinking. "3rd door past the elevators, east side. The bracket's there, but the extinguisher's been gone for about 3 weeks. I reported it to facilities, but I don't think it got replaced yet." Marcus stopped walking and pulled out his tablet, checking something. His eyebrows rose. "You're right. How did you—" He paused, understanding crossing his face. "The janitorial work. You've been paying attention to this stuff all along." "Hard not to when you're responsible for maintaining it," Daniel said, then worried he'd sounded defensive. "I mean, yes, I've been taking note of things. That's going to be invaluable, Marcus said, making a note on his tablet. Most people we train have to learn this building from scratch. You already know it better than half the people who work here. He looked at Daniel with something like reassessment. Evelyn was right about you being an asset. The words settled warmly in Daniel's chest, but he tried not to let them distract him. This was day 1 of 6 weeks. He couldn't coast on insider knowledge. He had to prove he could do the actual job. They spent the afternoon on customer service protocols, and this was where Daniel's previous experience came flooding back. 8 years of dealing with difficult clients, managing complaints, de-escalating tense situations, skills he'd maintained even while pushing a mop cart. Marcus presented scenarios and Daniel responded, drawing on instincts he'd thought had atrophied during his years of overnight invisibility. Okay, Marcus said, leaning back in his chair as they finished a role-play exercise. An executive is screaming at you because their important package hasn't arrived. They're threatening to complain to building management. How do you handle it? Daniel didn't hesitate. First, I stay calm. Their anger isn't about me, it's about their stress and the situation. I acknowledge their frustration. I understand this is urgent for you, and I'm going to help resolve it right now. Then I take action. Check the package log, contact the mailroom. Give them a specific timeline for when I'll have an answer. If the package truly isn't here, I offer solutions. Can it be resent? Is there another location it might have been delivered? The key is making them feel heard and showing them I'm actively working to solve their problem, not just deflecting. Marcus nodded slowly. That's textbook perfect. Where did you learn that approach? My last customer service job, before... Daniel paused, the familiar grief catching in his throat even after 5 years. Before my wife got sick. I worked at a car rental agency near the airport, dealt with a lot of stressed travelers, missed flights, vacation plans gone wrong. You learn pretty quickly that people don't want excuses. They want solutions, and they want to feel like someone cares. Well, you haven't lost that skill, Marcus said, making notes on his evaluation tablet. This is going well, Daniel, really well. Tomorrow we'll get into the technical systems, phones, computers, the tenant database. That'll be new territory for you. The technical training proved more challenging. Daniel had basic computer skills, but nothing sophisticated, and the integrated systems Meridian Tower used for managing tenant requests, visitor logs, and building access were complex. He stayed late that second day, practicing on the dummy system Marcus had set up, his fingers fumbling over keyboard shortcuts and drop-down menus until his eyes burned with fatigue. You're being too hard on yourself, Marcus said, watching Daniel complete the same visitor check-in sequence for the 5th time. It's day 2. You're not supposed to be perfect yet. I can't afford to be mediocre, Daniel replied, not looking up from the screen. People are watching this, waiting to see if I fail. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Some people, maybe. But the ones who matter are watching to see you succeed. There's a difference. He closed his own laptop and stood. Go home, Daniel. Get some rest. Your son probably wants to see you. The mention of Liam snapped Daniel out of his hyperfocus. It was after 6. He'd promised to be home by 5:30. You're right. Thank you. I'll see you tomorrow. He rushed home to find Liam already fed and bathed, courtesy of Mrs. Chen, playing with blocks in their small living space. The guilt of being late on only his second day warred with the reality that he'd been working to secure their future, and Daniel wasn't sure which feeling to let win. Daddy! Liam launched himself into Daniel's arms. Mrs. Chen said you're learning important computer stuff. I am, buddy, Daniel said, holding his son close and breathing in the simple comfort of his presence. It's harder than I expected, but I'm figuring it out. You're smart, Liam said, with the absolute certainty that only 5-year-olds possessed. You can do anything. If only it were that simple. The days blurred into a rhythm that was grueling but purposeful. Daniel arrived early each morning, stayed late most evenings, and spent his nights reviewing training materials after Liam went to sleep. Marcus pushed him hard but fairly, never lowering standards but always explaining the reasoning behind each protocol, each system, each procedure. By the end of the first week, Daniel's fingers had developed muscle memory for the computer systems. By the end of the second, he could navigate the tenant database without thinking. But the real test came at the start of week 3, when Marcus introduced him to live shadowing. You're going to spend the next 2 weeks at the actual front desk, Marcus explained that Monday morning. Observing during the first week, then taking over with supervision during the second. Jennifer, she's our current front desk manager, will be training you directly. Daniel felt his stomach drop. Jennifer Moss was a fixture at Meridian Tower, had been managing the front desk for 8 years. She was professional, efficient, and had never once acknowledged his existence during his 4 years of janitorial work. To her, he'd been invisible, just another member of the overnight crew who emptied trash bins and disappeared before the real workers arrived. Does she know about my background? Daniel asked carefully. Marcus's expression suggested he understood exactly what Daniel was asking. She knows you're transitioning from facilities services, and she knows Evelyn personally selected you for this training. That's all she needs to know. Jennifer turned out to be exactly as Daniel remembered. Mid-30s, impeccably dressed, with the kind of brisk efficiency that came from years of managing chaos disguised as routine. She looked him over when Marcus introduced them, her expression neutral but assessing. So you're the one everyone's been talking about, she said, and Daniel couldn't tell if that was positive or negative. Marcus says you already know the building inside out. I've worked here for 4 years, Daniel replied, keeping his voice even. Overnight facilities. Something flickered in Jennifer's eyes. Recognition, maybe, or surprise. The night janitor. I remember seeing you a few times when I worked late. She paused, and Daniel braced himself for judgment. Instead, she said, You always made sure everything was perfect before morning shift. I appreciated that. The unexpected acknowledgement caught Daniel off guard. Thank you. I tried to make things easier for the day staff. Well, now you'll be part of the day staff, Jennifer said, gesturing to the front desk. And this job is harder than it looks. You ready? The first day of shadowing was overwhelming. Jennifer managed approximately 50 interactions before lunch, signing in visitors, directing deliveries, answering phones, resolving tenant complaints, coordinating with building security, all while maintaining a pleasant demeanor and never appearing rushed. She made it look effortless, but Daniel could see the constant decision-making happening behind her professional smile, the way she prioritized and managed and juggled a dozen concerns simultaneously. The key, she told him during a brief lull, is staying 3 steps ahead. You're not just handling what's in front of you, you're anticipating what's coming next. See that courier who just walked in? By the time he reaches this desk, I've already noted which company's logo is on his uniform, pulled up their tenant list, and I'm ready to direct him to the right floor. Efficiency is respect. These people are busy. Don't waste their time. Daniel absorbed everything, taking mental notes and asking questions when Jennifer had a spare moment. By the end of the first shadowing day, his head was spinning with information and his feet hurt from standing for 8 hours straight. Ironic, given that he'd spent years working overnight shifts that were just as long, but somehow this felt different, more exposed, more demanding in ways that had nothing to do with physical labor. You did well today, Jennifer said as they prepared to leave. You ask good questions. You don't interrupt. You watch and learn. That's rarer than you'd think. I can't afford to waste this opportunity, Daniel said honestly. Jennifer studied him for a moment. Marcus told me about your interview, about what happened with the hiring panel. She paused, choosing her words carefully. I want you to know something. I've trained a lot of people for this desk. Some of them had fancy degrees and perfect resumes. A lot of them couldn't hack it because they thought customer service was beneath them, or they couldn't handle the pressure, or they just didn't care enough about doing it right. She met his eyes directly. You're going to be good at this job, Daniel. I can tell. Because you already understand something they had to learn the hard way. That all work has dignity, and how you do something matters more than what you're doing. The words hit Daniel harder than he expected, and he had to swallow against the sudden tightness in his throat. Thank you. That means a lot. Don't thank me yet, Jennifer said with a slight smile. Wait until you've survived your first medical emergency or dealt with your first impossible client. Then we'll see if you still want to be here. But Daniel did survive his first medical emergency on his 4th day of shadowing when an elderly woman visiting her daughter's office became dizzy and collapsed near the elevators. Without thinking, Daniel moved, his body remembering the training he'd maintained all these years. He stabilized her, checked her vital signs, kept her calm and talking while Jennifer called for paramedics. By the time the ambulance arrived, the woman was sitting up and insisting she was fine, embarrassed by the attention. "That was impressive," Jennifer said after the paramedics had taken the woman to the hospital for observation. "You didn't panic, you just handled it." "It's not my first time," Daniel admitted. 2 years ago, a man had a heart attack in the lobby during my overnight shift, had to do CPR until the ambulance got here. Jennifer's eyes widened. "That was you? Richard Hartley?" "I remember that incident. Building management talked about it for weeks." She paused, understanding dawning. "That's how Evelyn knew about you. She never forgot." "Apparently not," Daniel said quietly. Something shifted in Jennifer's demeanor after that day. She stopped treating Daniel like a trainee and started treating him like a colleague, sharing insights and shortcuts she'd developed over years of experience, trusting him with more complex tasks. By the end of the first shadowing week, she was letting him take the lead on routine interactions while she observed, only stepping in when something new arose. The second week, the supervised solo week, proved both exhilarating and terrifying. Daniel arrived each morning knowing he'd be managing the desk himself, with Jennifer nearby but not intervening unless absolutely necessary. Every interaction felt like a test, every decision weighted with the awareness that people were watching, judging, waiting to see if the former janitor could actually do this job. On Tuesday of that week, Trevor Ashford, the same operations manager who'd smirked his way through Daniel's interview, came through the lobby with a client. He stopped at the front desk, and Daniel saw the moment of recognition cross his face, followed by something that looked like discomfort. "Good morning," Daniel said professionally, keeping his voice neutral. "How can I help you?" Trevor cleared his throat. "We're heading up to the 8th floor, conference room B." Daniel pulled up the system, noting that conference room B was already reserved for another meeting. "I show that room is currently booked until 11. Conference room D is available if you need it sooner, or I can contact the 8th floor and see if they're running late." "Conference room D doesn't have the AV setup we need," Trevor said, his voice taking on an edge of impatience. "It does now," Daniel replied calmly. The AV system was upgraded in all conference rooms last month. Conference room D actually has a newer system than B. Better projection, improved acoustics. I can have someone from IT meet you there to walk you through the controls if you'd like. Trevor stared at him for a moment, clearly not expecting that level of detailed knowledge. His client, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes, looked impressed. "That would be helpful, thank you." Daniel made the call to a T, confirmed the setup, printed temporary access badges for Trevor and his client, and directed them to the elevators with clear instructions. The entire interaction took less than 3 minutes, but as Trevor walked away, Daniel saw him glance back with an expression that might have been grudging respect. "Nicely done," Jennifer murmured from her observation post nearby. "You could have just told him the room was booked and let him figure it out. Instead, you solved his problem before he even knew there was a solution. That's what makes someone good at this job." The validation steadied Daniel, but he knew one successful interaction didn't prove anything. He had to be consistent, had to demonstrate competence day after day until it became undeniable. And he had to do it while managing the constant awareness that he was performing a different kind of labor now, the labor of being visible, of representing not just himself but everyone who'd ever been underestimated based on circumstances rather than character. On Thursday, Daniel faced his first truly difficult client, a hedge fund executive named Richard Morrison, not the same Richard that Daniel had saved, but equally wealthy and twice as entitled, stormed up to the front desk at 9 a.m., his face red with anger. "Where the hell is my car?" he demanded, slamming his hand on the desk. "I called for my driver 20 minutes ago, and he's still not here." Daniel felt every eye in the lobby turn toward them, felt the weight of Jennifer's observation, felt the test inherent in this moment. He took a breath and met Morrison's angry gaze calmly. "Mr. Morrison, I apologize for the inconvenience. Let me look into this immediately." He pulled up the car service log, scanning quickly. "I see your call came in at 8:42. Your regular driver is currently caught in an accident on the interstate. No injuries, but significant traffic backup. The service dispatched a replacement driver who should arrive in approximately 8 minutes. 8 minutes? I have a meeting downtown that starts in 30 minutes. Yes, sir. I see that noted in your calendar sync, Daniel said, his voice remaining steady despite Morrison's volume. Given current traffic conditions and the location of your meeting, you'll arrive with about 10 minutes to spare. However, if you'd prefer, I can arrange for a rideshare to pick you up in 3 minutes instead, and have your driver meet you at your downtown location for your return trip. Your choice. Morrison opened his mouth, clearly prepared to continue his tirade, then stopped. Daniel could see the calculation happening. The realization that his problem was being solved rather than explained away, that he'd been given options rather than excuses. Fine. Arrange the rideshare. Daniel made the call, confirmed the pickup, and had a confirmation number for Morrison within 90 seconds. Your car will be here in 2 minutes, Mr. Morrison. Black sedan, license plate ending in 743. I've sent the details to your phone. Is there anything else you need? The hedge fund executive looked at Daniel, really looked at him, for the first time. No, that's fine, thank you. He paused awkwardly. Sorry for yelling. No apology necessary, sir. I understand the stress of a tight schedule. Have a good meeting. After Morrison left, the lobby seemed to exhale collectively. Jennifer walked over to the desk, her expression unreadable. Do you know who that was? Richard Morrison manages $2 billion and has made grown men cry with his tantrums. And you just de-escalated him like it was nothing. It wasn't nothing, Daniel said, his hands shaking slightly now that the adrenaline was fading. My heart was racing the whole time. But he didn't see that, Jennifer said firmly. He saw competence and calm. That's the job, Daniel. That's exactly the job. She paused, then added quietly, I'm going to recommend to Marcus that you're ready to go solo. You've more than proven yourself. The words should have filled Daniel with triumph, but instead he felt the weight of them. Going solo meant no more safety net, no more Jennifer watching from nearby ready to intervene. It meant being entirely responsible for whatever happened at that desk, for every interaction, every emergency, every decision. It meant being fully visible in a way he'd never been before. That evening, Daniel sat with Liam at their small table, helping his son with kindergarten homework, while his own mind churned with the implications of Jennifer's recommendation. In less than 2 weeks, he'd gone from supervised trainee to someone deemed ready for independent work. It felt simultaneously too fast and exactly right. Daddy, you're not paying attention, Liam said, tugging on Daniel's sleeve. I asked you what letter this is. Daniel focused on the worksheet. That's a G, buddy. Can you think of words that start with G? Grandma, Liam said immediately, and Daniel's chest tightened. Sarah's mother had passed away years before they'd even met. Liam had never known a grandparent, had no extended family, except for the community of neighbors and friends who'd stepped in to help. And great, like when you say I did a great job. You always do a great job, Daniel said, pulling his son close. I'm really proud of you, Liam. Do you know that? I know, Liam said with the simple confidence of a child who'd never doubted his father's love. Are you proud of you? The question caught Daniel completely off guard. What do you mean? Mrs. Chen says you're doing something really hard and really important, Liam explained, his small face serious. She says we should both be proud of you. Are you? Daniel thought about the question, really thought about it. Was he proud? He'd spent so long just surviving, just pushing through each day, that pride hadn't seemed like a relevant emotion. But now, looking at his son's expectant face, Daniel realized that pride wasn't about reaching the finish line. It was about having the courage to start running in the first place. Yeah, he said quietly. Yeah, I think I am. Good, Liam declared, returning his attention to his homework. 'Cause I'm super proud of you, even if your job is hard. That night, after Liam was asleep, Daniel sat at their small table reviewing his training materials one more time. Tomorrow was Friday, his last day of supervised solo work before Marcus's final evaluation. He'd come so far in these 3 weeks, had proven himself repeatedly, but he knew the next 3 weeks would be the real test. His phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Jennifer gave a glowing report. Meeting tomorrow at 4 p.m. to discuss your transition to full position. Great work, Daniel. Daniel read the message 3 times, letting the reality sink in. He was going to make it. Not because someone had given him charity, not because someone felt sorry for him, but because he'd proven, day after day, interaction after interaction, that he belonged at that desk. That merit mattered, that a man could be underestimated and still rise above those assumptions through competence and character. He looked around their small apartment, the cramped space that had been all he could afford, the secondhand furniture, the walls covered with Liam's artwork and photos of Sarah. Soon, they'd be able to move somewhere better. Soon, the medical bills would be manageable. Soon, he could start building the life he'd promised Sarah he would build for their son. But more than any of that, he'd proven something to himself, that he was more than the sum of his circumstances, that dignity wasn't something granted by job titles or income brackets, that being seen for who you really were, not who assumptions made you, could change everything. Daniel closed his training materials and allowed himself a moment of quiet gratitude. For Evelyn Cross, who'd run after him in the rain. For Marcus Chen, who trained him fairly. For Jennifer Moss, who'd seen his potential. For Ramon, who'd always treated him with dignity. For Mrs. Chen, who'd cared for Liam like her own grandson. For all the people who'd helped him reach this moment. And for Sarah, who'd believed in him even when he'd stopped believing in himself. Tomorrow was Friday, the beginning of the end of training, the start of something new. Daniel Harper went to bed that night knowing that the hardest parts were still ahead, that going solo meant facing challenges without a safety net, that there would be difficult days and demanding clients and moments when he questioned whether he could really do this. But he also went to bed knowing that he'd already overcome the biggest obstacle, the belief that he wasn't worthy of being seen. Everything else was just details. The meeting with Marcus at 4 p.m. on Friday felt both momentous and surprisingly casual. They sat in the same conference room where Daniel had filled out his initial paperwork 3 weeks ago, but everything felt different now. Marcus had his evaluation tablet open, but his expression was warm rather than formal. "I'm not going to drag this out," Marcus said, sliding a printed document across the table. "You've exceeded every benchmark we set for this training period. Jennifer's evaluation is one of the most positive I've seen in 5 years. Your technical proficiency scores are excellent, your customer service metrics are outstanding, and multiple tenants have specifically commented on your professionalism." He paused, a slight smile crossing his face. "You've proven that Evelyn's instincts about you were absolutely correct." Daniel picked up the evaluation report, scanning the rows of scores and comments that represented 3 weeks of grueling work and constant pressure to prove himself. Seeing it quantified like this, seeing objective evidence that he'd succeeded, made something in his chest loosen slightly. "So what happens now?" he asked. "Now we move you to independent operation for the final 3 weeks of your probationary period," Marcus explained. "You'll be handling the front desk solo during your assigned shifts. Jennifer will still be around if you need backup during overlap hours. And I'll be checking in regularly, but you're essentially running the show." He leaned forward slightly. "This is where it gets real, Daniel. Training scenarios are controlled. Real work is chaos. You're going to face situations we couldn't prepare you for, make decisions without time to consult anyone, and deal with problems that don't have clean solutions. How do you feel about that?" Daniel thought about the question honestly. 3 weeks ago, the prospect would have terrified him. Now, after countless interactions and challenges and moments of doubt overcome, he felt something different. Not quite confidence, that seemed too absolute, but competent readiness. The knowledge that he had the tools and the judgment to handle whatever came his way. "I feel ready," he said, "and I feel like I have support if I need it. That's more than I've had in a long time." Marcus nodded approvingly. "Good answer. Your solo shifts start Monday. Morning rotation, 7 a.m. to 3 p.m., Monday through Friday. That work with your childcare situation?" "It's perfect," Daniel said, thinking of mornings with Liam before school, afternoons picking him up, evenings together. The kind of normal he'd almost forgotten existed. "Thank you, Marcus, for everything. For training me fairly, for pushing me, for not lowering standards." "I didn't do you any favors by making it easy," Marcus replied. "You earned every bit of this, Daniel. Don't forget that when things get hard." He stood and extended his hand. "Welcome to the team officially, and congratulations." Daniel shook his hand, feeling the weight and the promise of those words. Welcome to the team. After 4 years of being invisible, of working in shadows while others succeeded in light, he was finally part of something visible, something that mattered in ways he could measure. That weekend, Daniel took Liam to the park, a rare luxury of time and energy that his new schedule would make possible. They fed the ducks at the pond, played on the swings, ate ice cream cones that dripped sticky sweetness onto their hands. And when Liam asked about Daddy's new job, Daniel found himself talking about it with something that felt dangerously close to pride. "So you'll be at a big desk," Liam said, processing the information with his 5-year-old literalism, "and people will come talk to you and you'll help them?" "That's right," Daniel confirmed. "Kind of like when you help your teacher pass out papers in class. You'll be doing an important job that helps everyone else do their jobs better. And you won't be tired all the time anymore?" The question pierced Daniel's heart because he hadn't realized how much his exhaustion had been visible to his son. "I'll still get tired sometimes, buddy, but not the same way. And I'll be home more. We'll have dinner together every night." Liam's face lit up with pure joy. "Every night? Even Mondays?" "Even Mondays," Daniel promised, pulling his son close. "Every single night." Monday morning arrived with the weight of new beginnings. Daniel dressed carefully in the polo shirt and khakis that constituted the front desk uniform, clothing provided by the company, fitting properly, marking him as official rather than makeshift. He dropped Liam at kindergarten, watching his son run into the building with his backpack bouncing, and felt the familiar tug of wanting to hold on to these moments while simultaneously pushing toward the future they were building. Meridian Tower's lobby at 6:45 a.m. was in that transitional period between night and day, the early arrivals trickling in while the overnight cleaning crew finished their final tasks. Daniel saw 2 members of that crew, people he'd worked alongside for years, and they stopped when they saw him approaching the front desk in uniform. "Daniel?" Maria, who'd been on his overnight team, looked confused and then understanding crossed her face. "You got the desk job, the one you interviewed for?" "I did," Daniel said, aware that his success story was also a reminder of the distance between where he'd been and where he was now. "Start solo today." "That's wonderful," Maria said, and her warmth seemed genuine. "You always said you wanted to move up. I'm happy for you." But her companion, a younger man named Josh, who'd only been with the overnight crew for 6 months, looked less convinced. "Must be nice," he muttered, just loud enough to hear. "Some people get handed opportunities while the rest of us keep scrubbing toilets." Daniel felt the words land like a slap, not because they were mean-spirited, Josh's voice held more resignation than malice, but because they represented a narrative he knew would follow him. That he'd gotten special treatment, that his promotion was charity rather than earned, that he'd somehow betrayed the overnight crew by accepting visibility. "It wasn't handed to me," Daniel said quietly, meeting Josh's eyes. "I was rejected in the interview. The CEO intervened because she'd seen me work for 4 years and knew I was qualified. Then I spent 3 weeks in the most intensive training I've ever experienced, proving myself every single day." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "And I hope my moving up means the next person from the overnight crew who applies for something better will be taken seriously, because we deserve to be seen as more than our current job titles." Josh looked away, something like embarrassment crossing his young face. Maria touched Daniel's arm gently. "You go show them what we're capable of," she said firmly. "Make us proud." Daniel carried those words with him as he took his position behind the front desk for the first time as the primary operator rather than a trainee. Jennifer arrived at 7 a.m. for the shift overlap, her presence comforting but no longer necessary. "You've got this," she said simply. "Trust your training, trust your instincts, and call me if you need backup, but I don't think you will." The morning started smoothly enough. Daniel signed in visitors, directed deliveries, answered phones, managed the steady flow of people entering the building for their workdays. Each interaction felt both routine and significant, proof that he belonged here, that his 3 weeks of training had prepared him adequately, that the overnight janitor really could handle the professional demands of this visible position. At 9:30, the smooth morning shattered. The fire alarm in the east wing of the 4th floor went off, its shrill warning echoing through the building's PA system. Daniel's training kicked in immediately. He pulled up the emergency protocols on his computer while simultaneously contacting building security and checking the fire panel that showed exactly which detector had been triggered. "Security, this is front desk," Daniel said into his radio, his voice calm despite his racing heart. Fire alarm, 4th floor, East Wing, Sector 7, initiating evacuation protocols. Copy that, Ramon's voice came back. Fire department's been automatically notified. Visual check in progress. Daniel activated the building-wide intercom system, speaking with the clear authority he'd practiced during training. Attention Meridian Tower occupants. We have a fire alarm activation on the 4th floor. Please proceed to the nearest stairwell and evacuate the building in an orderly fashion. Do not use the elevators. This is not a drill. People began streaming into the lobby from the elevators and stairwells, most looking annoyed rather than frightened. Evacuations happened occasionally, usually false alarms from construction dust or someone burning popcorn in a break room microwave. But Daniel couldn't assume this was routine. He coordinated with security, tracked the evacuation progress, directed people to assembly points outside the building, and fielded increasingly frantic calls from tenants wanting to know if this was real. 10 minutes into the evacuation, Ramon's voice came over the radio with an edge of urgency that made Daniel's stomach drop. Front desk, we've got smoke. 4th floor, East Wing conference room. Not a drill. Fire department is en route. ETA 3 minutes. Real fire. Not a drill. Daniel's mind raced through the protocols, the emergency procedures, the responsibilities that were now entirely his. Copy. Is everyone out of that sector? Checking now. Stand by. The next 3 minutes felt like hours. Daniel continued managing the evacuation, his voice steady over the intercom even as his hands shook slightly, directing building occupants to stay calm and move away from the building. The wail of fire trucks grew louder, and then firefighters were rushing through the lobby, heading for the stairs with equipment and purpose. Front desk, Ramon's voice crackled through the radio. All clear. Everyone's out. Small electrical fire in the conference room. Looks like a faulty power strip sparked some papers. Fire department's handling it. Daniel closed his eyes briefly, relief flooding through him. Copy that. Thank you, Ramon. He made another building-wide announcement, updating everyone on the situation and instructing them to remain outside until the fire department gave the all-clear. Then he pulled up the tenant contact list for the 4th floor and began making calls to building occupants to give them more detailed information, managing their concerns and questions with the calm professionalism Jennifer had drilled into him. By the time the fire department cleared the building for re-entry 45 minutes later, Daniel had fielded approximately 60 calls, coordinated with emergency services, managed the evacuation and re-entry of over 200 people, and somehow maintained his composure throughout. When the last tenant had returned to their office and the lobby had settled back into something approaching normalcy, he sat down in the front desk chair and realized his shirt was damp with sweat and his hands were trembling. Jennifer appeared beside the desk, having monitored the entire situation from the safety of the exterior assembly point. That, she said with something like awe in her voice, was a baptism by fire. Pun absolutely intended. Daniel, you were phenomenal. I've seen people with years of experience panic in situations like that. You stayed calm, followed protocols perfectly, and kept everyone informed and safe. I was terrified the entire time, Daniel admitted. So was I, Jennifer said. But nobody knew that except us. That's the job. You feel everything, but you show only competence. She paused, then added, I'm putting this in my report to Marcus. You just proved beyond any doubt that you can handle this position. The rest of the day passed in an exhausted blur. Several tenants stopped by the desk to personally thank Daniel for his handling of the evacuation, including the CEO of the finance company whose conference room had caught fire. By the time 3 p.m. arrived and his shift ended, Daniel felt wrung out but strangely exhilarated. He'd faced his first major crisis solo and had not only survived but excelled. He picked up Liam from kindergarten and listened to his son chatter about his day, finger painting and story time, and who had shared their crackers at snack, and felt the grounding normalcy of it wash over him. This was why he'd fought so hard for this opportunity. Not just for better pay or benefits, though those mattered enormously, but for this, the ability to be present for his son, to be part of normal life rhythms, to build a future that was about more than just survival. That evening, after Liam was asleep, Daniel's phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. He answered cautiously. Hello? Daniel, it's Evelyn Cross. I hope I'm not calling too late. Daniel sat up straighter, his exhaustion forgotten. No, not at all. Is everything okay? More than okay, Evelyn said, and he could hear the smile in her voice. Marcus sent me his preliminary evaluation, Jennifer's incident report about today's fire, and about a dozen emails from tenants praising your professionalism during the evacuation. She paused. I wanted to call and tell you personally how impressed I am. You've exceeded every expectation, Daniel. You've proven that my instincts about you were right. Thank you, Daniel said, his voice rough with emotion. I'm just trying to do the job well. You're doing more than that, Evelyn replied firmly. You're changing perceptions. You're showing people that assumptions about worth based on job titles are meaningless. Do you know what Richard Morrison told me today? Daniel remembered the hedge fund executive who'd yelled at him during training. I can imagine. He said, and I quote, "That new front desk guy is the best hire you've made in years. Sharp, professional, doesn't take crap but stays respectful. Where did you find him?" Evelyn's voice carried satisfaction. I told him you'd been working in the building for 4 years, that I'd been watching you long before you ever applied for the position. He was speechless. Daniel felt something warm and validating settle in his chest. I don't know what to say. Say you're going to keep doing exactly what you're doing, Evelyn said, because you're not just succeeding, Daniel. You're proving a point that needs proving. That merit matters more than pedigree. That character matters more than credentials. That someone can be underestimated and still rise above those assumptions through competence and integrity. She paused. Your story matters. Don't forget that. After they hung up, Daniel sat in the quiet apartment, processing everything. 3 weeks ago, he'd been a janitor with a rejected job application and borrowed suit. Now he was receiving personal calls from a billionaire CEO, managing crisis situations with competence, earning praise from clients who wouldn't have seen him before. The transformation felt surreal, like something that had happened to someone else. But his sore feet reminded him it was real. His exhaustion was real. The proud texts from Mrs. Chen were real. The smile on Liam's face when Daniel had picked him up on time was real. This was his life now, not perfect, not without challenges, but fundamentally different in ways that mattered. The next 2 weeks passed in a rhythm of challenges met and competencies proven. Daniel handled a water leak on the 6th floor, coordinating with maintenance and communicating with affected tenants. He managed a dispute between a delivery driver and building security with diplomatic efficiency. He memorized the names and preferences of regular visitors, greeted executives with appropriate formality, and maintained the kind of professional warmth that made people feel welcome without being intrusive. But on Wednesday of his 5th week, Daniel faced a test that had nothing to do with building management and everything to do with navigating the complex social dynamics of his new position. Patricia Moreland, the HR director who'd led his disastrous initial interview, approached the front desk mid-morning with a manila folder and an expression that suggested she'd rather be anywhere else. Daniel saw her coming and felt his stomach tighten with old tension, but he kept his expression professionally neutral. "Good morning, Ms. Moreland," he said evenly. "How can I help you?" Patricia set the folder on the desk, not quite meeting his eyes. "I need to drop this off for building management. It's the updated emergency contact list for our department." She paused, and Daniel could see her internal struggle playing out across her face. "And I owe you an apology, a real one, not the inadequate one I gave in that conference room." Daniel hadn't expected this. "Miss Moreland, you don't have to—" "Yes, I do," she interrupted, finally looking at him directly. "I've been through 2 sessions of the bias training Evelyn mandated, and I've spent a lot of time thinking about that interview, about the assumptions I made, about how I let those assumptions override my professional judgment." She took a breath. "You were qualified. You were more than qualified. And I rejected you based on surface-level prejudices I didn't even realize I was holding. That's inexcusable." The words hung between them, honest and uncomfortable. Daniel could have accepted them graciously and moved on, let her off the hook easily, but something in him resisted the easy path. "Can I ask you something?" he said quietly. "When you looked at my application, when you saw janitorial services as my current position, what did you actually think? Not what you think you should say now, but what genuinely went through your mind then." Patricia flinched slightly, but to her credit, she didn't deflect. I thought you were overreaching. I thought you didn't understand what the position required. I thought, she paused, clearly forcing herself to be honest. I thought people who clean buildings don't have the skills or presence for client-facing roles. I saw your job title and stopped seeing you as a person with potential. Thank you for being honest, Daniel said, and he meant it. That's what I needed to hear, because that kind of thinking, that's what keeps people trapped. When we decide someone's current circumstances define their capabilities, we rob them of the chance to show us what they're actually capable of. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I don't tell you this to make you feel worse, but to help you understand why that interview hurt so much. It wasn't just about one job. It was about being told, again, that I wasn't enough, that my 4 years of reliable work, my proven crisis management, my actual qualifications, none of that mattered as much as the fact that I pushed a mop cart. Patricia's eyes were bright with unshed tears. I'm so sorry, Daniel, truly. And I'm grateful, more than you know, that Evelyn intervened. Because watching you work these past few weeks, seeing how good you are at this job, has forced me to confront my own biases in ways that have been painful but necessary. Daniel nodded slowly. This was real contrition, not performative guilt. I appreciate you saying that, and I appreciate that you're doing the work to change. That matters more than a perfect apology. For what it's worth, Patricia added, I've been recommending changes to our hiring practices. Blind resume reviews for initial screening, standardized interview questions, mandatory bias training for anyone involved in hiring decisions. Evelyn's been receptive to all of it. Your experience is literally changing how we operate as a company. That revelation landed with unexpected weight. His rejection, his struggle, his eventual success, it wasn't just about him. It was becoming part of something larger, a shift in how this company thought about potential and worth and opportunity. That's good, Daniel said quietly. Really good. Because I'm not the only person who's ever been underestimated. If my experience helps even one other person get a fair chance, then something worthwhile came from it. Patricia picked up her folder, preparing to leave, then paused. You're a better person than I gave you credit for, Daniel Harper. Thank you for this conversation, and thank you for the grace you've shown throughout this entire situation. After she left, Daniel sat with the complexity of that interaction. He'd been angry at Patricia for weeks, had nursed justified resentment about her role in his initial rejection. But her apology had been genuine, her commitment to change seemed real, and holding on to anger when someone was actively working to do better felt counterproductive. Maybe that was part of what Evelyn had meant about his story mattering, not just the success itself, but the grace with which he navigated it. The way he chose dignity over bitterness, education over retribution, forward progress over backward-looking revenge. The rest of that day passed normally. Calls answered, visitors directed, minor crises managed with efficient calm. But as Daniel's shift ended and he prepared to pick up Liam, he reflected on how much had changed in 5 weeks. Not just his job title or his schedule or his financial situation, though all of those were significant. But something deeper, his sense of himself, his understanding of his own worth, his belief that being seen for who he really was could actually happen in a world that so often chose not to see. He picked up Liam from school and they walked home together, his son's small hand in his, chattering about playground politics and upcoming field trips. And Daniel realized that this ordinary afternoon, this normal routine, this simple presence was the real victory. Not the front desk position or the CEO's praise or the tenant compliments, though those mattered, but the ability to be present for his son, to build a life that was about more than just survival, to show Liam through actions rather than words that dignity and hard work and refusing to accept other people's limitations could actually change your circumstances. That evening, after dinner and homework and bath time, Liam asked Daniel to tell him a story before bed. Usually, Daniel read from books, but tonight his son wanted something different. "Tell me a story about you, Daddy," Liam requested, snuggling under his blankets. "About when you were brave." Daniel thought about all the moments of bravery over the past 5 weeks, walking into that interview, accepting Evelyn's intervention, enduring the training pressure, managing the fire evacuation. But the moment that came to mind was simpler. and somehow more significant. Once upon a time, Daniel began, there was a man who worked very hard at a job that other people didn't always notice. He cleaned buildings at night while most people slept, and he did it with care and pride because he believed all honest work deserved to be done well. But sometimes he wished people could see that he was capable of more than just cleaning. Like you, Liam whispered, understanding immediately. Like me, Daniel confirmed, pulling his son close. And one day, he was brave enough to ask for a chance to show people what he could really do. Some people said no. They looked at what he was doing and couldn't imagine him doing anything different. But one person said yes, she saw who he really was, not just what his job made him seem, and that gave him the chance to be brave again, every single day, by working hard and proving he deserved that chance. Did he prove it? Liam asked, even though he clearly knew the answer. He's still proving it, Daniel said honestly. Every day. Because being brave isn't something you do once. It's something you choose again and again, even when it's hard, even when you're scared, even when people doubt you. Liam was quiet for a moment, processing this. Then he said something that made Daniel's throat tighten with emotion. I want to be brave like that when I grow up. You already are, buddy, Daniel whispered. You're the bravest person I know. After Liam fell asleep, Daniel sat at their small table with a cup of coffee and allowed himself to think about the final week ahead. One more week of probation, one more week of proving himself, and then, if all went well, the position would become permanent. The thought should have filled him with anxiety, but instead, he felt calm, prepared, ready. He'd come so far from that afternoon when he'd walked out of an interview carrying his dignity like armor because it was all he had left. He'd transformed from invisible to visible, from overlooked to valued, from survival mode to something that felt dangerously close to thriving. And he'd done it not through luck or charity, but through the patient accumulation of competence and the refusal to let other people's assumptions define his worth. One more week, 7 more days of showing up and doing the work with integrity and skill. 7 more days of being present for his son, of building a future that honored Sarah's memory and Liam's potential. 7 more days of proving that the overnight janitor really did belong behind that front desk, that merit actually mattered, that being seen could change everything. Daniel finished his coffee and went to bed, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to demonstrate why Evelyn Cross had run after him in the rain, why Marcus Chen had trained him rigorously, why Jennifer Moss had believed in his potential. And knowing that he was ready, not because he was perfect or fearless, but because he'd learned that bravery wasn't the absence of fear. It was showing up despite the fear, working hard despite the doubt, choosing dignity despite the pressure to settle for less. The final week would be his chance to prove that truth one more time. And Daniel Harper was more than ready for it. The final week began on a Monday morning that felt both ordinary and weighted with significance. Daniel arrived at Meridian Tower at 6:45 as usual, the October air crisp with the promise of autumn fully taking hold. He dressed with particular care that morning, his uniform pressed, his shoes polished, carrying himself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd earned his place through competence rather than luck. Liam had wished him good luck at drop-off, wrapping his small arms around Daniel's neck and whispering, "You're gonna be great, Daddy," with the absolute certainty that only children possessed. The lobby was just beginning to fill with early arrivals when Daniel took his position behind the front desk. Ramon caught his eye from the security station and gave him a subtle nod of encouragement. Jennifer wouldn't be overlapping shifts this week. This was Daniel's final test of complete independence, his chance to demonstrate that he could handle the position without backup or supervision. The morning progressed smoothly, each interaction reinforcing the routines Daniel had internalized over the past 5 weeks. He greeted executives by name, directed visitors with efficient warmth, managed phone calls and deliveries with the kind of seamless multitasking that looked effortless but required constant awareness. By lunch, he'd handled approximately 40 interactions without a single misstep, and he allowed himself to feel cautiously optimistic about the week ahead. That optimism lasted until 2:15 when Richard Hartley walked through the rotating doors. Daniel recognized him immediately. How could he not? This was the man whose life he'd saved 2 years ago, the business partner Evelyn had mentioned, the reason she'd been paying attention when Daniel applied for the front desk position. Hartley was in his late 50s, distinguished in the way that came from decades of success, carrying himself with the confidence of someone who'd never had to question whether he belonged anywhere. Hartley approached the desk, and Daniel saw the exact moment recognition flickered across the executive's face. His steps slowed slightly, his expression shifting from businesslike neutrality to something more complex: surprise, recognition, and what might have been embarrassment. "Mr. Hartley," Daniel said professionally, keeping his voice warm but not overly familiar. "Welcome back to Meridian Tower. How can I help you today?" Hartley stopped at the desk, studying Daniel's face as if confirming what he was seeing. "You're the janitor, the man who saved my life." "I'm Daniel Harper," Daniel replied evenly, not denying the history but not letting it define him either. "I currently work the front desk. Are you here to see someone specific?" "I'm meeting with Evelyn," Hartley said, still processing Daniel's presence in this new context. "But I have to say, I'm surprised to see you here, in this capacity." Daniel could hear the unspoken question beneath those words, the confusion about how a janitor ended up at the front desk, the assumptions about what that transition meant. He met Hartley's gaze directly. "Ms. Cross recognized that my qualifications extended beyond facilities services. I went through 6 weeks of training and evaluation. Today is the start of my final probationary week before the position becomes permanent." Something shifted in Hartley's expression, not quite approval, but a reassessment. "I see. Well, that's good. You certainly proved you could handle pressure during that incident 2 years ago." He paused, and Daniel could see him working through something internally. "I never properly thanked you for that, did I? I tried to give you money, and you refused, and I think I felt awkward about it afterward. But you saved my life, Daniel. That's not a small thing." "You're welcome," Daniel said simply. "I'm glad you recovered fully. Ms. Cross's office is on the 12th floor. Should I let her assistant know you're here?" "Please," Hartley said, then added, "And Daniel? I'm going to tell Evelyn how impressed I am with this. She made the right call." After Hartley headed to the elevators, Daniel felt something settle in his chest, a piece of validation he hadn't known he needed. The man whose life he'd saved saw him as capable in this role, saw him as more than the janitor who'd performed CPR, saw him as someone who belonged behind this desk. The rest of Monday passed without incident, as did Tuesday and Wednesday. Daniel managed his responsibilities with increasing confidence, handled complex situations with competence, and received positive feedback from multiple tenants who'd been watching his transition with interest. By Wednesday evening, as he walked home with Liam chattering about his upcoming school Halloween party, Daniel allowed himself to believe that he might actually pull this off, that Friday's final evaluation would confirm what he already knew. He'd earned this position, proven his worth, demonstrated that merit mattered more than assumptions. Thursday morning shattered that growing confidence. Daniel arrived at 7 a.m. to find a crisis already in progress. A major water main had broken on the 3rd floor overnight, flooding 2 law offices and causing significant damage. The overnight facilities crew had contained the immediate problem, but affected tenants were arriving to find their offices inaccessible, important documents potentially damaged, and meetings that needed immediate relocation. Jennifer was there, having been called in early, but she made it clear this was Daniel's crisis to manage. "You've got this," she said, already coordinating with the restoration company. "I'm here as backup only. Show them what you can do." Daniel took a deep breath and dove into the chaos. He pulled up the building's conference room availability, started making calls to affected tenants to explain the situation before they arrived, coordinated temporary office space allocation, and worked with building maintenance to establish a timeline for repairs. His phone rang constantly, his computer screen filled with urgent emails, and he managed it all with the kind of focused intensity that left no room for doubt or hesitation. By 8 a.m., he'd relocated 3 law firms to temporary conference rooms, arranged for document restoration services to meet with affected tenants, and set up a communication system to keep everyone informed of repair progress. The crisis was far from over, but it was managed, contained, organized, with clear pathways forward. "That was extraordinary," Jennifer said at 8:30, watching Daniel handle yet another anxious call with calm professionalism. You just coordinated a response to a major building emergency like you've been doing this for years. I'm just following protocols, Daniel said, though his hands were shaking slightly from the adrenaline. No, Jennifer corrected firmly. You're doing more than that. You're making judgment calls, prioritizing needs, managing stress. That's not protocol. That's skill. She paused, then added quietly, You're going to ace tomorrow's evaluation, Daniel. There's no question. But Daniel couldn't quite let himself believe that. Not yet. Not when there was still one more day, one more chance for something to go wrong, one more opportunity to prove that maybe he wasn't ready after all. Friday morning arrived with the weight of finality. Daniel's 6-week probationary period ended today. Marcus would be conducting his final evaluation at 3 p.m., and the results would determine whether this position became permanent or whether Daniel found himself back in the overnight facilities crew, his attempt at visibility having failed. He dropped Liam at school with promises to celebrate that evening regardless of the outcome. Mrs. Chen had offered to make her special dumplings. For celebration or comfort, whatever you need, she'd said with her characteristic kindness. Daniel had hugged her gratefully, aware that his support system extended far beyond just himself and his son, that he'd built a community of people who cared about his success. The morning passed in a blur of routine responsibilities, punctuated by the awareness that Marcus was somewhere in the building, observing, evaluating, making his final determination about Daniel's future. Every interaction felt weighted with significance, every decision a potential test. When lunch arrived, Daniel couldn't eat, his stomach too tight with nervous energy. At 2:30, Marcus appeared at the front desk. Daniel, can you step away for a few minutes? Jennifer's going to cover while we talk. This was it, the moment that would determine everything. They walked to the same conference room where this had all begun 6 weeks ago, where Patricia and Trevor and Rebecca had rejected him based on assumptions, where Evelyn had later confronted those assumptions, where Daniel had filled out paperwork that promised benefits and opportunity and a chance to be seen. Now, he sat across from Marcus again, but this time he wasn't wearing a borrowed suit that didn't fit. This time, he belonged here. Marcus opened his tablet and pulled up what was clearly a comprehensive evaluation document. 6 weeks ago, you walked into this building as a janitor applying for a position you'd been told you weren't qualified for. Today, you're one of the most competent front desk operators I've ever had the privilege of training. He looked up from his tablet, his expression warm. Daniel, you've exceeded every metric we set. Your technical proficiency is excellent. Your customer service ratings are outstanding. Your crisis management, particularly during the fire evacuation and yesterday's flooding emergency, has been exemplary. Multiple tenants have specifically requested that you continue in this role. Evelyn has personally told me that hiring you was one of the best decisions she's made this year. Daniel felt his throat tighten with emotion, but Marcus wasn't finished. More than that, you've changed the culture here. People are questioning their assumptions about worth and potential. We've had 3 other employees from facilities services inquire about career advancement opportunities in the past month, something that hadn't happened in years before you. You've proven that talent exists everywhere if we're willing to see it. Marcus paused, his voice taking on a more serious tone. But I need to ask you something honestly. This transition hasn't been easy. You've faced scrutiny and pressure that other candidates wouldn't experience. You've had to prove yourself over and over. Are you sure you want to continue in this position? Because if you do, it becomes permanent today. Full benefits, standard salary for the role, and the expectation that you'll continue performing at this level. Daniel thought about the question, really thought about it. These 6 weeks had been grueling, exhausting, filled with moments of doubt and pressure, and the constant awareness that he was being watched and evaluated in ways that went beyond standard job performance. But they'd also been transformative. He'd rediscovered skills he thought he'd lost, proven capabilities he'd stopped believing he possessed, and most importantly, he'd shown his son that circumstances didn't have to be permanent, that dignity and hard work could actually change your situation. I want this, Daniel said firmly, not because it's easier than facilities work. In some ways it's harder, but because it lets me be present for my son in ways I haven't been able to be for 5 years. Because it's challenged me to grow in ways I'd stopped believing were possible. And because someone believed I was capable when I'd almost stopped believing it myself. I want to honor that faith by continuing to do this work with integrity and excellence." Marcus smiled, and there was genuine warmth in his expression. "That's exactly what I hoped you'd say. In that case, it's my pleasure to inform you that your probationary period is complete and you've been approved for permanent employment as Meridian Tower's front desk operator. Congratulations, Daniel. You earned this." The words should have brought overwhelming relief or joy, but what Daniel felt was something quieter and more profound, a sense of rightness, of pieces finally falling into place, of a future that had seemed impossible 6 weeks ago, suddenly becoming real and solid and attainable. "Thank you," he managed, his voice rough with emotion. "Thank you for training me fairly, for pushing me, for never lowering standards. That meant everything." "You made it easy," Marcus replied. "You came in every day ready to work, ready to learn, ready to prove yourself. That's all any of us can do." He stood and extended his hand. "Welcome to the permanent team, Daniel Harper. Now get back to that desk. You've got 2.5 more hours in your shift." Daniel shook his hand, feeling the weight and the promise of this moment, then walked back to the front desk where Jennifer was fielding calls with her characteristic efficiency. When she saw his face, her expression broke into a wide smile. "Permanent?" she asked, though she clearly already knew the answer. "Permanent," Daniel confirmed, and saying it out loud made it real in ways that Marcus's official notification hadn't quite achieved. Jennifer came around the desk and pulled him into a quick hug. "I'm so proud of you. You've worked harder than anyone I've ever trained, and you've proven every single day that you belong here. This building is better because you're part of it." The rest of the shift passed in a haze of normal responsibilities, punctuated by the awareness that everything had changed. This wasn't a probationary position anymore. This wasn't temporary. This was his job, his future, his chance to build something stable and sustainable for himself and his son. At 3 p.m., as Daniel's shift ended, Evelyn Cross stepped off the elevator and walked directly to the front desk. She was smiling, and in her hand was a small envelope. "I heard the good news from Marcus," she said without preamble. "Congratulations, Daniel. You've proven everything I believed about you when I ran after you in the rain 6 weeks ago." "Thank you," Daniel said, aware that everyone in the lobby was watching this interaction. The CEO talking to the front desk operator with obvious warmth and respect. "For everything, for seeing me when other people didn't, for giving me a real chance, for refusing to let assumptions override merit. You changed my life, Ms. Cross." "Evelyn," she corrected gently, "and you changed your own life, Daniel. I just opened a door. You're the one who walked through it and proved you belonged on the other side." She handed him the envelope. "This is from the entire executive team. A small token of appreciation for your work these past 6 weeks. And there's something else." She pulled out her phone and showed him an email. Daniel scanned it quickly, his eyes widening as he absorbed the content. It was a building-wide announcement about new hiring practices. Blind resume reviews, standardized interviews, mandatory bias training, and a formal career advancement program for all building employees regardless of current position. At the bottom, it read, "These changes were inspired by Daniel Harper, whose transition from facilities services to front desk operations has demonstrated the importance of seeing potential rather than just credentials." "You did that," Evelyn said quietly. "Your story, your success, your willingness to keep pushing even when it was hard, that's changing how this entire organization thinks about opportunity and worth. That matters more than any single job, Daniel. That's a legacy." Daniel felt tears prick his eyes, and he didn't try to hide them. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll keep being exactly who you are," Evelyn replied. "Keep showing up, keep doing excellent work, and keep proving that merit matters more than assumptions. That's all anyone can ask." She left with a final smile, and Daniel stood behind the front desk that was now officially his, holding an envelope he hadn't yet opened and processing the reality that his story had become larger than just himself, that his success was opening doors for others, that being seen had created visibility for people who'd been invisible. He opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a card signed by Marcus, Jennifer, Evelyn, and several other executives he'd interacted with over the past weeks. The messages were warm and congratulatory, but what caught his attention was the check attached, a bonus equivalent to a month's salary with a note that read, For excellence in crisis management and exceptional service during your probationary period. Daniel stared at the check, calculating rapidly. This was enough to pay down a significant chunk of the medical bills. Enough to buy Liam new clothes that fit properly. Enough to finally feel like they were moving forward instead of just treading water. He clocked out precisely at 3 p.m., gathered his things, and walked out of Meridian Tower as something he'd never been before, a permanent employee with benefits and security and a future that extended beyond just survival. The October afternoon was beautiful, the sun warm despite the cooling temperatures, and Daniel took a moment to just stand outside the building and breathe. He picked up Liam from school, and his son took one look at his face and started jumping up and down with excitement. "You got it! You got the permanent job!" "I did, buddy," Daniel confirmed, scooping Liam up and spinning him around despite being exhausted. "I really did." "I knew you would," Liam said with absolute confidence. "You're the best daddy in the whole world. Can we celebrate with ice cream?" They celebrated with ice cream and then went to Mrs. Chen's apartment where she'd prepared her promised dumplings. Ramon stopped by after his shift ended, bringing a small bottle of champagne he insisted Daniel accept. They sat around Mrs. Chen's tiny kitchen table, this makeshift family that had formed from necessity and kindness, and celebrated a victory that belonged to all of them in different ways. "You made us all proud," Mrs. Chen said, her eyes wet with tears. "Your Sarah would be so proud too." Daniel thought about Sarah often, but in that moment he felt her presence more acutely than he had in months. She'd made him promise in those last days that he wouldn't give up, on himself, on their son, on building a life worth living, and he'd kept that promise. Through the hardest years, through the overnight shifts and the exhaustion, and the moments when giving up seemed easier than continuing, he'd kept pushing forward. And now, finally, he could see the fruits of that persistence. That evening, after Liam was asleep, Daniel sat at their small table with the bonus check and a calculator, working through numbers that suddenly looked manageable instead of insurmountable. The medical bills that had loomed over him for years could be significantly reduced. They could move to a larger apartment, not immediately, but soon. Liam could have the new shoes he needed, the school supplies Daniel had been stretching to afford. They could build an emergency fund, start saving for Liam's future education, create the kind of financial stability Daniel had almost forgotten was possible. But more than the money, more than the benefits, more than any material improvement, what mattered most was the shift in how Daniel saw himself. 6 weeks ago, he'd been a man who'd internalized years of being invisible, of having his worth measured by his job title, of believing that circumstances were permanent and unchangeable. Now, he was someone who'd proven, to himself as much as anyone, that assumptions could be overcome, that merit could triumph over bias, that being truly seen could transform everything. The following Monday, Daniel returned to work as a permanent employee. The difference was subtle, but significant. His name now appeared in the building directory, his benefits were fully activated, his position secure. He settled into the rhythm of the work, each day bringing new challenges and opportunities to demonstrate competence. Weeks passed, then months. October gave way to November, then December. Daniel and Liam moved to a 2-bedroom apartment in a better neighborhood, close enough to Meridian Tower that Daniel could walk to work. Liam thrived with the stability of regular routines and a father who was present for dinner every night, for homework help, for bedtime stories. The medical bills shrank steadily, no longer the overwhelming burden they'd been for years. On a Friday afternoon in mid-December, Daniel was managing the usual end-of-week rush when a familiar face approached the desk. It was Josh, the young man from the overnight facilities crew who'd made the bitter comment about opportunities being handed to Daniel months ago. He looked nervous, carrying a folder Daniel recognized immediately, a job application. "Daniel," Josh said, his voice tentative, "I was wondering if you could answer some questions about the Career Advancement Program. I'm thinking about applying for a position in building operations." Daniel could have been dismissive, could have reminded Josh of his earlier judgment, could have let the younger man struggle through the process without help. Instead, he saw himself 6 months ago, uncertain, carrying hope like something fragile, believing he might not be enough. "Of course," Daniel said warmly. "Why don't you come around the desk and I'll walk you through the application process?" The program is specifically designed to give people like us a real chance to advance based on our skills and potential, not just our current titles. As Daniel helped Josh navigate the application, explaining what to emphasize and how to present his experience, he realized this was part of what Evelyn had meant about legacy. His success had created pathways for others. His visibility had made it possible for people who'd been invisible to imagine different futures for themselves. That mattered more than any individual achievement. Christmas came and went, the first holiday season in years, where Daniel didn't have to choose between gifts for Liam and paying bills. They spent the day at Mrs. Chen's apartment with Ramon and a few other neighbors, this chosen family that had formed from shared struggles and mutual support. Liam was deliriously happy with his new books and building blocks, but what made Daniel's throat tight with emotion was watching his son's face as they decorated their new apartment together, hanging lights and stockings in a space that finally felt like a real home. On New Year's Eve, after Liam had fallen asleep despite his best efforts to stay awake until midnight, Daniel stood at the window of their apartment looking out at the city lights. 6 months ago, his future had seemed locked in place. Endless overnight shifts, mounting debt, survival mode that never quite allowed for thriving. Now he had security and stability and the kind of life he'd almost stopped believing was attainable. His phone buzzed with a text from Evelyn. "Happy New Year, Daniel. Grateful every day that I ran after you in the rain. You've made Meridian Tower better just by being yourself." Daniel read the message several times, feeling the weight of gratitude and responsibility it carried. He'd been given a chance, a real, genuine chance, and he'd proven himself worthy of it. But more than that, he'd helped create a system where others might receive similar chances, where assumptions about worth based on job titles were being challenged, where merit was starting to matter more than appearances. He thought about the journey from that afternoon when he'd walked out of an interview carrying only his dignity, to this moment standing in his own apartment with a sleeping son and a secure future. It hadn't been linear or easy. It had required resilience and competence and the willingness to be vulnerable enough to accept help when it was offered. It had required advocates like Evelyn who saw potential where others saw only limitations. It had required a community of support that lifted him when he stumbled and celebrated when he succeeded. But mostly, it had required Daniel's own choice. The choice to believe he was worthy of being seen. The choice to show up every day and prove himself. The choice to maintain dignity even when circumstances suggested it was a luxury he couldn't afford. In January, Daniel received his first performance review as a permanent employee. Marcus's evaluation was glowing, noting exceptional customer service, consistent professionalism, and impressive crisis management skills. But what made Daniel pause was the final note. Daniel Harper exemplifies the values we want to cultivate across all departments: integrity, competence, and the understanding that all work has dignity when done with excellence. Recommend for consideration in Leadership Development Program. Leadership Development. 6 months ago, he'd been fighting just to be considered for the front desk. Now, he was being considered for advancement beyond it. The trajectory seemed impossible, and yet here it was, documented in an official performance review. He showed the review to Liam that evening over dinner, explaining what it meant in terms a 6-year-old could understand. "So you might get an even better job?" Liam asked, his eyes wide. "Someday, maybe," Daniel said carefully. "If I keep working hard and keep learning, but I'm really happy with the job I have right now, buddy. It lets me be here with you, and that's the most important thing." "I'm proud of you, Daddy," Liam said seriously. "You're really brave." Those words, from his son, meant more than any performance review or professional recognition ever could. Because ultimately, everything Daniel had fought for, the interview he'd refused to beg through, the training he'd endured, the scrutiny he'd faced, the competence he'd proven, all of it had been for Liam. To show him that circumstances weren't permanent, that dignity mattered, that being seen for who you really were could change everything. On a Thursday in late January, Daniel was managing the afternoon shift when Patricia Moreland approached the desk. She'd become a regular presence over the months, often stopping to chat briefly or share updates about the hiring practice changes she'd been implementing. But today, her expression carried something different, pride mixed with satisfaction. "Daniel, I wanted to tell you something before the official announcement goes out," she said, leaning against the desk. "We just hired our first employee through the new career advancement program, Maria Rodriguez from the overnight facilities crew. She's moving into a building operations coordinator role." Daniel felt his breath catch. Maria, his former colleague who'd congratulated him on his success, who told him to make them proud. "That's wonderful. She's incredibly capable." "She specifically mentioned you in her interview," Patricia continued. "Said that watching your transition made her believe advancement was possible, that your success gave her permission to imagine a different future for herself." She paused, her eyes bright. "You're changing lives, Daniel, not just your own. That's a rare and precious thing." After Patricia left, Daniel sat with the weight and the wonder of that revelation. His story had become larger than himself. His visibility had created possibility for others. The janitor who'd saved a life had become the front desk operator who'd changed a system. And that system was now opening doors for people like Maria, like Josh, like countless others who'd been told by circumstance or assumption that their current position defined their potential. 6 months had passed since that September afternoon when Evelyn Cross had run after him in the rain. 6 months since he'd stood outside Meridian Tower feeling like a failure, carrying a borrowed suit and the last fragments of his dignity. 6 months since someone had finally looked past his job title and seen his actual worth. In those 6 months, Daniel Harper had transformed from invisible to visible, from overlooked to valued, from survival mode to genuine thriving. He'd proven that merit mattered more than pedigree, that character counted more than credentials, that someone could be underestimated and still rise above those assumptions through competence and integrity. But more than any of that, he'd proven something to himself, that he was worthy of being seen, that his hard work had value, that choosing dignity over desperation had been right even when it seemed like a luxury he couldn't afford. As his shift ended and Daniel prepared to walk home to his son, to their apartment that felt like a real home, to a life that was about more than just surviving, he thought about all the people who'd helped him reach this moment. Evelyn, who'd seen potential where others saw only limitations. Marcus, who'd trained him rigorously and fairly. Jennifer, who'd shared her expertise generously. Ramon and Mrs. Chen, who'd supported him through the hardest transitions. And Sarah, whose memory had kept him pushing forward, even when giving up seemed easier. But mostly, he thought about Liam, waiting at home with homework that needed checking and stories that needed reading, growing up watching his father choose courage over safety, dignity over desperation, hope over resignation. That was the real legacy, not the job title or the salary or even the system changes he'd helped inspire, but the example he was setting for his son, showing him through actions rather than words that being truly seen for your character, your competence, your worth could change everything. Daniel walked out of Meridian Tower into the cold January evening, no longer invisible, no longer overlooked, no longer just the janitor who cleaned after midnight. He was Daniel Harper, front desk operator, permanent employee, living proof that merit mattered and dignity was never a luxury you couldn't afford. And that changed everything.